Okay, you're so fucking piss me off. What did you fucking do? Okay. Fucking watch the shit. Oh, so. Good. Wait. Yes. Hey. Oh, God. things. Some pictures and shit. Looks like this is no warfare. What are the outcomes?
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. And first I want to say thank you so much for supporting the channel. The comments, subscriptions, all the input is really making me feel great. It makes me feel like I'm on the right track with sharing this content with you, with sharing this childhood trauma work with you guys. And I'm really touched with how it's resonating, and your feedback is really helpful. I've been meaning to do this video for a while because throughout my career in both inpatient psychiatry and in private practice, I often get a common question about sort of from a family member, from a spouse, from a child, of a parent. The question is sort of, my dad is really narcissistic, or my mom is really narcissistic, or my partner is can you see them because I think they have childhood trauma? And if it's real narcissism or NPD of that, is I tend to sort of say, therapy is often counterindicated for someone who has that. It's extremely unlikely, and unfortunately it's extremely rare that therapy can help somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, because therapy doesn't fit into their image of themselves. And there's a whole series of reasons why. And it's interesting, when I try to explain the reasons why therapy with a narcissist tends to not work, is I see the person's inner child who struggles with giving up on people who are bad for them, which is a very common rooted inner child thing, is to give up on somebody who's bad for you, or give up the hope of the bad person's potential, which is a whole thing in and of itself. Is I find that the person struggles with my answer, or why I'm explaining it in that way. In other words, explaining why therapy doesn't work. So I wanted to come up with a video to show you why therapy with a narcissist tends to not work, tends to be counterindicated. And as you're watching the video, what I've done is I've done a role play with therapy with a narcissist in 2 quick sessions, these are shortened sessions, and to highlight the bullet points of having that pathology work, trying to work with a therapist, as you can see how the whole thing plays out. So as you're watching, I want you to be thinking about the word image. The narcissist is totally focused on image of their own image, being in love with their own image, but more importantly, where it gets nasty is how they are being perceived by others. So hopefully, I think you know what I mean by that. So session 1 is the first session, obviously. Session 2 is sort of the second and final session with this person. And I hopefully that this is helpful. In a separate video after this, I'm going to be conducting a clinical analysis to explain the pathology of what is going on in the session in real time. And hopefully maybe that'll line up with what you guys are thinking. And here it goes. We'll just get into it. Well, hey, welcome. It's good to meet you. And we spoke on the phone, and you mentioned you wanted to do some work around some infidelity issues that you have in your life, and understand that your wife recently caught you cheating and recommended that you come see somebody. And I understand things aren't really going that well. Why don't you tell me a little bit more about it? The thing got really complicated really fast, Patrick. It just got out of hand. And I want you to know up front, though, I wasn't just looking for sex. I mean, sex was a part of it, but I was really just trying to help this woman out. Like, she had a bad boss, she had a bad marriage, she had the kids, it was a mess. And I don't know, I just sort of fell into it, you know? And, you know, I see a ring on your finger, and I'm sure you understand that in a marriages get lonely, you know? Marriages can get barren. And I'm sure you can understand that. But no, things aren't really good right now between you and I. But you know what I was thinking, like on the way over here, I was thinking of struggling with this, is maybe you can help me out with this, is I'm starting to feel like I gotta ask you, is that, am I a bad person in this, Patrick? Because I feel like this thing just sort of took off. It just could have happened to me. And I feel like I'm a bad person. Well, that's a big question, you know, and it's well, the way I tend to look at that or a question like that is I try to go back and take a look at people's childhood. And one thing I'm curious, maybe we can just jump in about if there was any infidelity between your parents growing up. And I feel like a good trauma therapist will ask about that modeling, about what went on at home. And what a good trauma therapist would also ask you, what age did you start to cope with your feelings by using things like sex or food? Well, here's the whole thing. You know, I'm an open book. I will tell you the whole thing. And my dad worked hard. He played hard. And I felt really bad for my mom in that. But, you know, she's a very negative, complicated person. And honestly, I would see them fight all the time. Every other day, the house was blown up in some kind of fight. And honestly, Patrick, I would side with him because he had stronger points in the arguments, and she just tended to be really negative. But out of that, though, is I feel like growing up between the two of them, I feel like I have a gift about sort of seeing both sides of things, looking at one person in their shoes, looking at the other person in their shoes. I'm sure you can relate to that as a therapist. I'd probably be a good therapist myself because I really find that I can see many angles of what's going on with people. Well, that was helpful, and there's a lot there. It sounds like that dad maybe didn't respect your mother, and maybe your mother had some codependency going on. You know, I'm curious about, for kids who grow up in that kind of constant distrust and argumentative environment, it's kind of related to maybe the problem you came up with, is that children growing up in that, they don't really see parents value each other. They don't see parents respect each other. They don't see parents honoring each other or enjoying each other. And it's, from what you described it's simply the current problem might be something that was modeled for you. But what was going on at home is I would file that under emotional abuse. You know, it is what it is. And I think they were just unhappy. And that's just how it kind of played out. Well, sure. But I'm just curious about, as I'm describing it as emotional abuse, one thing that I'm curious about is when I describe it as that, for kids who grow up in daily fighting, it is fall under that category of emotional abuse. But you know, to be honest, you know, it's a little bit creepy. You know, I don't really like thinking about it that way, and I learned a lot from them. You know, they were good people. They were just complicated in their relationship. It's a bit creepy. Yeah, to think about it, you know, to kind of go back. Well, we're at time, and you can think about how you felt in this session. And if you wanted to book another session, I would really think about that, because you mentioned the word creepy, but how you felt about us processing some of this stuff or talking about it, is these sessions are hard in that way. But I find that they are related to the present problem, and we try to shift by figuring out where the problem started. What I have people do is I have them pick up a book called Homecoming by John Bradshaw and read the first 4 chapters, which are very helpful and related to some of this stuff and the impact of what growing up in that environment was like. And it can help with a lot of stuff. All right, sounds good. I can handle it. Okay. Well, hey, good to see you. Why don't you tell me how the week was? And I'm curious about how you felt when you left the session last time. You know, I felt amazing, and I felt really hopeful, and I feel grateful for you because you really held that stuff about my parents last time. Well, I'm not that good, But maybe you felt good about naming something big, and we can start to dig in and process. But stuff doesn't really get healed in one session in that way. Did you get a chance to get that Bradshaw book? Got it online. Only took a couple days. You know what? Give it to my wife. I'm sorry. How do you mean? It's this whole thing. But I know I shouldn't have, and I know what you're gonna say. But the day after I saw you, I was going through her phone, and it turns out that she's been talking to her mother and her friends about wondering if she should leave me or not. Can you effing believe that? So it's like 11 o'clock, and I wake her up, and I throw the book on the bed, and I tell her she probably has a worse childhood than I did, and she's more messed up than I am. Whoa, I'm a little bit confused, She's probably appropriately seeking help from her friends to sort of deal with, given that there was cheating a couple weeks ago. Not when she's sharing our business with the whole world. She's a very to get that Bradshaw book. Homecoming by John Bradshaw, and read the first 4 chapters, which are very helpful and related to some of this stuff and the impact of what growing up in that environment was like. And it can help with a lot of stuff. All right, sounds good. I can handle it. Okay. Stuff and the impact of what growing up in that environment was like. And it can help with a lot of stuff. All right, sounds good. I can handle it. Okay. Well, hey, good to see you. Why don't you tell me how the week was? And I'm curious about how you felt when you left the session last time. I felt amazing, and I felt really hopeful, and I feel grateful for you because you really held that stuff about my parents last time. Well, I'm not that good, but maybe you felt good about naming something big, and we can start to dig in and process. But stuff doesn't really get healed in one session in that way. Did you get a chance to get that Bradshaw book? Got it online. Only took a couple days. You know what? Give it to my wife. I'm sorry. How do you mean? It's this whole thing, but I know I shouldn't have, and I know what you're gonna say. But the day after I saw you, I was going through her phone, and it turns out that she's been talking to her mother and her friends about wondering if she should leave me or not. Can you effing believe that? So it's like 11 o'clock, and I wake her up, and I throw the book on the bed, and I tell her she probably has a worse childhood than I did, and she's more messed up than I am. Whoa, I'm a little bit confused, She's probably appropriately seeking help from her friends to sort of deal with, given that there was cheating a couple weeks ago. Not when she's sharing our business with the whole world. She's a very complicated, negative person. And I have to see these people. Well, but who should she be talking to? Therapist. Trust me, though, you don't want her, though, because, how many hours do you have to just have her complain about me in here? Well, let's just back up a little bit, Mark, and, you wanted some help about the cheating, and now, if I have you right, you're in a very different place with her. Totally. It's not just me in this. Well, I'm curious about, you gave her the book, but what about you reading the book to go over maybe what we discussed last time about your parents? Patrick, I'm a little bit taken aback because I'm not really feeling very supported in this with you. I have to see these people, and they only hear her side of the argument in this. Yeah, it's messy when a partner cheats, right? You know, I wonder what would make this maybe more productive between the two of us is to ask a weird question. I'm just going to jump in there is, how would maybe your father handle your situation right now if he was in it? I ask that because I'm just going to be blunt, is that I think you're minimizing your infidelity and switching the focus on her. You know what, Patrick? I think what would be more productive in this conversation is to talk about maybe where you went to school. You know, I think going to a social worker and whatever that is was clearly a mistake, and I should have gone to a PhD. Well, Mark, now you're switching the focus and trying to put me down a notch. You can see whoever you like. Look, I'm sorry. I was just hoping I could find someone who could really get me. And before I go, I should have said this up front, but before I go today, I need a letter stating that I'm engaged in therapy with you. You could say I'm depressed or something. I'm sorry, letter for what? That's not really that important. You can just say, you can address it to whom it may concern. Well, Mark, this is only our second session. I would really need to know what the letter is for. Look, that's my business, and it's easy. I can go grab a cup of coffee. With the time left we have in this session, you can write up the letter, I'll grab it, and I'll go. I know your business, so you don't have to do it outside the session. Mark, being engaged in therapy is at least a month or 2 months for me, and I don't feel comfortable giving you a letter if I don't really know what it's for. Hey, Patrick, that's fine. You know what? Then I'm just not going to pay for the session then, okay? Mark, I think I'm terminating you. This is really not a good fit. You can send me somewhere else. Sounds good to me. So there you have it. And as you can see, the last session ended, and it quickly went off the rails. And I find that has happened because the therapist was challenging the narcissist about their perception and how they were behaving with the wife. It could have been a wife who had cheated. It doesn't really matter the gender of the person. I'm not trying to sort of spell anything out about men in this case. It really could be anybody. It could be a parent, a sibling. And I'm just trying to spell out to you what that person is like with the therapist. In short, they're not that different with the therapist. The therapist is not really going to have a lot of power outside of the usual sort of trying to idolize me and have some charm going on. It'll end up where it usually ends up in terms of a relationship sort of with a narcissist. So, and again, in a separate video, I'll be doing a clinical analysis that you guys can watch out for shortly after to get into spelling out the pathology.
My head hurts. My body's anxious. I'm really stressed, overwhelmed, exhausted, and I don't know what to do. Does that sound familiar? Stick around. I'm going to show you the vagus nerve reset exercise that helps your nervous system relax. That doesn't tolerate this, no problem. You can just do it with one hand behind your back and put the one that needs to rest down at the side. If both shoulders can't tolerate it, again, no problem, just have both of them down. The last thing I'll say is if you want, you can put a pillow here. So go ahead and put your hands behind your head and you can prop it so that the arm doesn't go all the way back flat. If it doesn't tolerate full range of motion back in this position, you can prop one or both of them as much or as little as you need to. So take
Swedish inventor of the microchip that's designed to go into people's arms that will do things like store records of jabs and things like that. That's a conspiracy theory. No, this is actually being reported in mainstream media now. You know, there's that time gap between conspiracy and reality that is about a few months now. This is the next one. Anyway, the Swedish inventor behind that, a guy named Hans Joblad, I think that's how you pronounce it. Why do these people always sound like baddies from Die Hard? Anyway, he said that this is going to be rolled out, whether you like it or not. And this is the video I shared previously. Now, this was actually taken down and called misinformation on this platform. I peeled it and it was put back up because it's literally taken from mainstream media. Like, literally taken from mainstream media to say they reinstated it after an appeal. I'm sure many people are happy to roll up their sleeves. It sounds like people have already started doing that and have been doing it in places like Sweden. But me, my sleeves are going to remain down. Why? Because I can see past next week. Ta-ta.
Man is a mystery. It needs to be unraveled. And if you spend your whole life unraveling it, don't say that you've wasted time. I am studying that mystery because I want to be a human being. Each of us occupies two worlds. There is the outer world of people, places, and things, and there is the inner. I am studying that mystery because I want to be a human being. Each of us occupies two worlds. There is the outer world of people, places, and things, and there is the inner world of our thoughts, feelings, sensations, and intuitions. The outer world we share with others, while our inner world is a place where we stay alone. These two worlds also differ in the skills needed for their navigation. We can be a great success in the external world and all the while be wrapped by immense inner suffering. On the other hand, the world may be crumbling around us, but if we have learned to conquer our psyche, we can still exist in relative peace. In our day, where success is primarily measured by external metrics, most of us devote more energy to conquering the world outside of us than we do to mastering the world within. But this choice can come with great costs. For our inner world is the one place from which escape is impossible, and so the quality of our life is always contingent on the state of our psyche. In this video, we are going to provide a guide for achieving a more harmonious relationship to this world within. Not everything that is faced can be changed, wrote James Baldwin, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. The first step toward attaining a greater mastery of our inner world is to stop denying, ignoring, or numbing ourselves to the events of our psyche. Many people, afraid or ashamed of what they may see if they take an honest look within, resort to drugs and alcohol or other defense mechanisms to quiet any psychic conflicts. But the more we seal ourselves off from our inner world, the more we create a threat from what should be our greatest ally. The path to inner harmony always goes through our psychic conflicts, as denial will only cause such conflicts to intensify. If shame is preventing us from admitting to our psychological problems, then it can be helpful to realize that psychological discord is far more the norm than the exception, and that inner demons are but an inevitable part of what it means to be human. As we begin this process of opening up to our inner world, we may be frightened by what we discover. For the longer we have spent denying what is going on within, the less comfortable we will be with the strange thoughts and disturbing emotions that may rise to the fore. We may even wonder if the state of our psyche is in such disarray that a descent into madness is possible. The psychologist Carl Jung noticed that many of his patients had this very concern, but he believed this concern could be tempered when we recognize that this is but a natural phase in the process of inner growth. When a patient begins to feel the inescapable nature of his inner development, wrote Jung, he may easily be overcome by a panic fear that he is slipping helplessly into some kind of madness that he can no longer understand. More than once I have had to reach for a book on my shelves to show my patient his terrifying fantasy in the form in which it appeared 400 years ago. This has a calming effect, because the patient then sees that he is not alone in a strange world which nobody understands, but is part of the great stream of human history, which has experienced countless times the very things that he regards as a pathological proof of his craziness. Once we are willing to face up to what is taking place in our psyche, we can then determine what is causing our inner discord. Are we crippled by anxiety and self-doubt? Are we consumed by hopelessness and depression? Or do intrusive thoughts haunt our every move? Identifying what is wrong with us is far more important than answering the question of why we are the way we are. Trying to solve the riddle of why will often lead us on a never-ending search that only produces self-pity, resentment, and no clear answers. But if we answer the question of what exactly is ailing us, then we can focus our attention on devising strategies to overcome our problems. The strategies we devise, however, must obey one overriding criteria. They must introduce a tangible degree of novelty into our life. More of the same will only perpetuate our problems, and therefore our goal at this stage is to search for techniques and tools that change the way we experience and interact with our inner world. But what tools will work best for us can never be known in advance. Far too often people view psychological ailments exactly as they do those of the physical body. We all share the same general structure of the body, and so the cure for a broken leg, an infection, or a virus will require similar steps for each of us. But in searching for ways to overcome the conflicts of our inner world, we need to recognize that while there is a uniformity to our psyche, there is no unity. For on the one side, our psyche is sculpted by our human nature, and this produces the collective side of man. But we are also individuals. No two people share the same environment, genes, life history, goals, or innate strengths and weaknesses, and this individuality produces a unique configuration to the terrain of our inner world and necessitates an idiosyncratic trial and error approach to the mastery of our psyche. For as Jung never tired of stating, there is no one psychology that defines us all, nor is there one set of psychological techniques that will be universally effective. To speak of a science of individual psychology, wrote Jung, is already a contradiction in terms. It is only the collective element in the psychology of an individual that constitutes an object for science. For the individual is by definition something unique that cannot be compared with anything else. A psychologist who professes a scientific individual psychology is simply denying individual psychology. He exposes his individual psychology to the legitimate suspicion of being merely his own psychology. The psychology of every individual would need its own manual, for the general manual can deal only with collective psychology. Richard Bach echoed Jung's sentiment when he said that if ever there were a manual written for advanced souls, it would have to end with the following words: everything in this book may be wrong. We can turn to people for advice and use the tools they have devised, but what will work best for our current situation is for us to discover. If we try a technique that others have used with great success and it does little to help us, we should not take this as a sign that we are incurable. It just means we need a different tool to escape from the chasm of our mind into which we have fallen. If we really desire to attain a level of mastery over our psyche, we should experiment with techniques that work on all three of the main forms of human experience: our behaviors, our thoughts, and our emotions. Behaviorists, wrote Michael Mahoney, have favored behavior as the primary force in human experience and argued that changes in motor activity produce changes in attitudes and affect. Cognitivists have rallied around the primary power of thought and argued that changes in thinking produce changes in both behavior and feeling. The third group, variously called humanists, experientialists, and evocative therapists, have asserted the primacy of emotionality in driving the other two realms. Not surprisingly, each group has endorsed a different emphasis in psychological services. Behaviorists have emphasized action, cognitivists have been partial to insight and reflection, and humanists have encouraged emotional experience and expression. Fortunately, there are behavioral, cognitive, and experiential techniques that address all the most common forms of psychological suffering, and so there is no shortage of tools at our disposal. We merely need to seek them out, experiment with a variety of them, and exploit the gains from those techniques that have a positive effect on our life. As we begin on this trial and error journey, there is a simple shift in our mindset that can help us remain persistent, and this is learning to take life a little less seriously. For while W.B. Yeats may have claimed that we can only begin to live when we conceive life as tragedy, it may be truer to say that we can only begin to live when we conceive life as comedy. Many people are perpetually weighed down by their fears, anxieties, doubts, and hostilities because they see everything that happens to them as having life-shattering implications. But with such a mindset, we place the weight of the world on our shoulders, and in so doing, we are inevitably crushed. To grant us a lightness to our step that can energize and embolden us as we strive to overcome our inner demons and to create a more harmonious state of our inner world, we should try something different. We should laugh at the darkness of our thoughts, smile at the moment of a fear, or feel excited at the rush of anxiety. As soon as you have made a thought, laugh at it. This may seem like strange advice, but as the poet Robert Frost wisely remarked, if we couldn't laugh, we would all go insane.
The old appeals to racial, sexual, and religious chauvinism, to rabid nationalist fervor are beginning not to work.
This is who I am and whether I'm good or bad or achieving or not, all that's learned along the way.
Just thrive. You can change it any time you want. It's all you, choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money.
Realize if I had the game wrong, the game was to find out what I already was.
We were saying how very important it is to bring about in the human mind the radical revolution. The crisis is a crisis in consciousness, a crisis that cannot anymore accept the old norms, the old patterns, the ancient traditions. And considering what the world is now, with all the misery, conflict, destructive brutality, aggression, and so on, man is still as he was. Is still brutal, violent, aggressive, acquisitive, competitive, and he has built a society along these lines.
Society today is composed of a series of institutions, from political institutions, legal institutions, religious institutions, to institutions of social class, familial values, and occupational specialization. It is obvious the profound influence these traditionalized structures have in shaping our understandings and perspectives. Yet, of all the social institutions we are born into, directed by, and conditioned upon, there seems to be no system as taken for granted and misunderstood as the monetary system. Taking on nearly religious proportions, the established monetary institution exists as one of the most unquestioned forms of faith there is. How money is created, the policies by which it is governed, and how it truly affects society are unregistered interests of the great majority of the population. In a world where 1% of the population owns 40% of the planet's wealth, in a world where 34,000 children die every single day from poverty and preventable diseases, and where 50% of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day, one thing is clear: something is very wrong. And whether we are aware of it or not, the lifeblood of all of our established institutions, and thus society itself, is money. Therefore, understanding this institution of monetary policy is critical to understanding why our lives are the way they are. Unfortunately, economics is often viewed with confusion and boredom. Endless streams of financial jargon, coupled with intimidating mathematics, quickly deters people from attempts at understanding it. However, the fact is, the complexity associated with the financial system is a mere mask, designed to conceal one of the most socially paralyzing structures humanity has ever endured. A number of years ago, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The Fed replies, saying, sure, we'll buy $10 billion in government bonds from you. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to the sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designated a value of $10 billion to the Fed. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt, and when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money or value can be created out of debt or liability will become more clear as we further this exercise. So the exchange has been made, and now $10 billion sits in a commercial bank account. Here's where it gets really interesting. For as based on the fractional reserve practice, that $10 billion deposit instantly becomes part of the bank's reserves, just as all deposits do. And regarding reserve requirements, as stated in modern money mechanics, a bank must maintain legally required reserves equal to a prescribed percentage of its deposits. It then quantifies this by stating, under current regulations, the reserve requirement against most transaction accounts is 10%. This means that with a $10 billion deposit, 10% or $1 billion is held as the required reserve, while the other $9 billion is considered an excessive reserve and can be used as the basis for new loans. Now, it is logical to assume that this $9 billion is literally coming out of the existing $10 billion deposit. However, this is actually not the case. What really happens is that the $9 billion is simply created out of thin air on top of the existing $10 billion deposit. This is how the money supply is expanded. As stated in modern money mechanics, of course they, the banks, do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes, loan contracts, in exchange for credits, money, to the borrower's transaction accounts. In other words, the $9 billion can be created out of nothing simply because there is a demand for such a loan and that there is a $10 billion deposit to satisfy the reserve requirements. Now, let's assume that somebody walks into this bank and borrows the newly available $9 billion. They will then most likely take that money and deposit it into their own bank account. The process then repeats, for that deposit becomes part of the bank's reserves. 10% is isolated, and in turn 90% of the $9 billion, or $8.1 billion, is now available as newly created money for more loans. And of course, that 8.1 can be loaned out and redeposited, creating an additional 7.2 billion to 6.5 billion to 5.9 billion, etc. This deposit money creation loan cycle can technically go on to infinity. The average mathematical result is that about $90 billion can be created on top of the original 10 billion. In other words, for every deposit that ever occurs in the banking system, about 9 times that amount can be created out of thin air.
Money jitters. Ask the obliging Bank of America for a jar of soothing instant money, MONEY, in the form of a convenient personal loan.
So, now that we understand how money is created by this fractional reserve banking system, a logical yet elusive question might come to mind. What is actually giving this newly created money value? The answer? The money that already exists. The new money essentially steals value from the existing money supply. For the total pool of money is being increased irrespective of demand for goods and services. And as supply and demand defines equilibrium, prices rise, diminishing the purchasing power of each individual dollar. This is generally referred to as inflation, and inflation is essentially a hidden tax on the public.
What is the advice that you generally get? And that is inflate the currency. They don't say debase the currency. They don't say devalue the currency. They don't say cheat the people who are saved. They say lower the interest rates. The real deception is when we distort the value of money. When we create money out of thin air, we have no savings, and yet there's so-called capital. So my question boils down to this. How in the world can we expect to solve the problems of inflation, that is, the increase in the supply of money, with more inflation?
Of course, it can't. The fractional reserve system of monetary expansion is inherently inflationary. For the act of expanding the money supply, without there being a proportional expansion of goods and services in the economy, will always debase the currency. In fact, a quick glance at the historical values of the US dollar versus the money supply reflects this point definitively, for the inverse relationship is obvious. $1 in 1913 required $21.60 in 2007 to match value. That is a 96% devaluation. since the Federal Reserve came into existence. Now, if this reality of inherent and perpetual inflation seems absurd and economically self-defeating, hold that thought, for absurdity is an understatement in regard to how our financial system really operates. For in our financial system, money is debt, and debt is money. Here is a chart of the U.S. money supply from 1950 to 2006. Here is a chart of the U.S. national debt for the same period. How interesting it is that the trends are virtually the same. For the more money there is, the more debt there is. The more debt there is, the more money there is. To put it a different way, every single dollar in your wallet is owed to somebody by somebody. For remember, the only way the money can come into existence is from loans. Therefore, if everyone in the country were able to pay off all debts, including the government, there would not be $1 in circulation.
And I think I'm gonna stop eating meat for I don't know.
In fact, the last time in American history the national debt was completely paid off was in 1835, after President Andrew Jackson shut down the central bank that preceded the Federal Reserve. In fact, Jackson's entire political platform essentially revolved around his commitment to shut down the central bank, stating at one point, "The bold efforts the present bank has made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it." Unfortunately, this message was short-lived, and the international bankers succeeded to install another central bank in 1913, the Federal Reserve. And as long as this institution exists, perpetual debt is guaranteed. Now, so far, we have discussed the reality that money is created out of debt through loans. These loans are based on a bank's reserves, and reserves are derived from deposits. And through this fractional reserve system, any one deposit can create 9 times its original value, in turn debasing the existing money supply, raising prices in society. And since all this money is created out of debt and circulated randomly through commerce, people become detached from their original debt, and a disequilibrium exists, where people are forced to compete for labor in order to pull enough money out of the money supply to cover their costs of living. As dysfunctional and backwards as all of this might seem, there is still one thing we have omitted in this equation. And it is this element of the structure which reveals the truly fraudulent nature of the system itself. The application of interest. When the government borrows money from the Fed, or when a person borrows money from a bank, it almost always has to be paid back with accrued interest. In other words, almost every single dollar that exists must be eventually returned to a bank with interest paid as well. But if all money is borrowed from the central bank and is expanded by commercial banks through loans, only what would be referred to as the principal is being created in the money supply. So then, where is the money to cover all of the interest that is charged? Nowhere. It doesn't exist. The ramifications of this are staggering. The amount of money owed back to the banks will always exceed the amount of money that is available in circulation. This is why inflation is a constant in the economy, for new money is always needed to help cover the perpetual deficit built into the system, caused by the need to pay the interest. What this also means is that mathematically, defaults and bankruptcy are literally built into the system, and there will always be poor pockets of society that get the short end of the stick. An analogy would be a game of musical chairs, for once the music stops, somebody is left out to dry. And that's the point. It invariably transfers true wealth from the individual to the banks. For if you are unable to pay for your mortgage, they will take your property. This is particularly enraging when you realize that not only is such a default inevitable due to the fractional reserve practice, but also because of the fact that the money that the bank loaned to you didn't even legally exist in the first place. In 1969, there was a Minnesota court case involving a man named Jerome Daly, who was challenging the foreclosure of his home by the bank which provided the loan to purchase it. His argument was that the mortgage contract required both parties, being he and the bank, each put up a legitimate form of property for the exchange. In legal language, this is called consideration. Mr. Daly explained that the money was, in fact, not the property of the bank, for it was created out of nothing as soon as the loan agreement was signed. Remember what modern money mechanics stated about loans? What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes in exchange for credits. Reserves are unchanged by the loan transactions, but deposit credits constitute new additions to the total deposits of the banking system. In other words, the money doesn't come out of their existing assets. The bank is simply inventing it, putting up nothing of its own, except for a theoretical liability on paper. As the court case progressed, the bank's president, Mr. Morgan, took the stand, and in the judge's personal memorandum, he recalled that the plaintiff, the bank's president, admitted that, in combination with the Federal Reserve Bank, did create the money and credit upon its books by bookkeeping entry. The money and credit first came into existence when they created it. Mr. Morgan admitted that no United States law or statute existed which gave him the right to do this. A lawful consideration must exist and be tendered to support the note. The jury found that there was no lawful consideration, and I agree. He also poetically added, only God can create something of value out of nothing. And upon this revelation, the court rejected the bank's claim for foreclosure, and Daly kept his home. The implications of this court decision are immense. For every time you borrow money from a bank, whether it is a mortgage loan or a credit card charge, the money given to you is not only counterfeit, it is an illegitimate form of consideration, and hence voids the contract to repay, for the bank never had the money as property to begin with. Unfortunately, such legal realizations are suppressed and ignored, and the game of perpetual wealth transfer and perpetual debt continues. And this brings us to the ultimate question: why? During the American Civil War, President Lincoln bypassed the high-interest loans offered by the European banks and decided to do what the Founding Fathers advocated, which was to create an independent and inherently debt-free currency. It was called the greenback. Shortly after this measure was taken, an internal document circulated between private British and American banking interests stated, slavery is but the owning of labor and carries with it the care of laborers, while the European plan is that capital shall control labor by controlling wages. This can be done by controlling the money. It will not do to allow the greenback, as we cannot control that. The fractional reserve policy perpetrated by the Federal Reserve, which has spread in practice to the great majority of banks in the world, is, in fact, a system of modern slavery. Think about it. Money is created out of debt. And what do people do when they are in debt? They submit to employment to pay it off. But if money can only be created out of loans, how can society ever be debt-free? It can't. And that's the point. And it is the fear of losing assets coupled with the struggle to keep up with the perpetual debt and inflation inherent in the system, compounded by the inescapable scarcity within the money supply itself, created by the interest that can never be repaid, that keeps the wage slave in line, running on the hamster wheel with millions of others, in effect powering an empire that truly benefits only the elite at the top of the pyramid. For, at the end of the day, who are you really working for? The banks. Money is created in a bank and invariably ends up in a bank. They are the true masters, along with the corporations and governments they support. Physical slavery requires people to be housed and fed. Economic slavery requires people to feed and house themselves. It is one of the most ingenious scams for social manipulation ever created, and at its core, It is an invisible war against the population. Debt is the weapon used to conquer and enslave societies, and interest is its prime ammunition. And as the majority walks around oblivious to this reality, the banks, in collusion with governments and corporations, continue to perfect and expand their tactics of economic warfare, spawning new bases, such as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, while also inventing a new type of soldier, the birth of the economic hitman.
We economic hitmen really have been the ones responsible for creating this first truly global empire. And we work many different ways. But perhaps the most common is that we will identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our big corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, industrial parks, ports, things that benefit a few rich people in that country, in addition to our corporations, but really don't help the majority of the people at all. However, those people, the whole country is left holding a huge debt, and such a big debt they can't repay it, and that's part of the plan. They can't repay it. And so at some point, economic hitmen go back to them and say, listen, you lost a lot of money, can't pay your debt, so sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Allow us to build a military base in your country, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq, or vote with us on the next UN vote to have their electric utility company privatized and their water and sewage system privatized and sold to U.S. corporations or other multinational corporations. So there's that whole mushrooming thing, and it's so typical of the way the IMF and the World Bank work. That you put a country in debt, and such a big debt it can't pay it, and then you offer to refinance that debt and pay even more interest. And you demand this quid pro quo, which you call a conditionality or good governance, which means basically that they've got to sell off their resources, including many of their social services, their utility companies, their school systems, sometimes their penal systems, their insurance systems, to foreign corporations. So it's a double, triple, quadruple whammy. The precedent for economic capitalism began back in the early 50s when democratically elected Mossadegh was elected in Iran. He was considered to be the hope for democracy, at least around the world. He was Time Magazine's man of the year. But one of the things that he run on and began to implement was the idea that foreign oil companies needed to pay the Iranian people a lot more for the oil that they were taking out of Iran. The Iranian people should benefit from their own oil. Strange policy. We didn't like that, of course. But we were afraid to do what we normally were doing, which was to send in the military. Instead, we sent in one CIA agent, Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's relative. And Kermit went in with a few $1 million and was very, very effective and efficient. And in a short amount of time, he managed to get Mossadegh overthrown and brought in the Shah of Iran to replace him. Always was favorable to oil. And it was extremely effective.
Overflow Iran. Army officers shout that Mossadegh has surrendered and his regime as virtual dictator of Iran is ended. Pictures of the Shah are paraded through the streets as sentiment reverses. The Shah is welcome home.
So back here in the United States, in Washington, people looked around and said, wow, that was easy and cheap. So this established a whole new way of manipulating countries, of creating empire. Only problem with Roosevelt was that he was a card-carrying CIA agent, and had he been caught, the ramifications could have been pretty serious. So very quickly at that point, the decision was made to use private consultants to channel the money through the World Bank or the IMF or one of the other such agencies, bringing people like me who worked for private companies, so that if we got caught, there would be no governmental ramifications. when Arbenz became president of Guatemala, the country was very much under the thumbs of United Fruit Company, the big international corporations. And Arbenz ran on this ticket that says, we want to get the land back to the people. And once he took power, he was implementing policies that would do exactly that, give the land rights back to the people. United Fruit didn't like that very much. And so they hired a public relations firm, launched a huge campaign in the United States to convince the United States people, the citizens of the United States, the press of the United States, and the Congress of the United States that Arbenz was a Soviet puppet. And that if we allowed him to stay in power, the Soviets would have a foothold in this hemisphere. And that, at that point in time, was a huge fear on everybody's mind, the Red Terror, the Communist Terror. And so, to make a long story short, out of this public relations campaign came a commitment on the part of the CIA and the military to take this man out. And in fact, we did. We sent in planes, we sent in soldiers, we sent in jackals, we sent everything in to take him out, and did take him out. And as soon as he was removed from office, the new guy that took over after him basically reinstated everything to the big international corporations, including United Fruit. Ecuador, for many, many years, have been ruled by pro-U.S. dictators, and often relatively brutal. Then it was decided that we were going to have a truly democratic election. Jaime Roldos ran for office. And his main goal, he said, as president, would be to make sure that Ecuador's resources were used to help the people. And he won overwhelmingly, by more votes than anybody had ever won anything in Ecuador. And he began to implement these policies to make sure that the profits from oil went to help the people. Well, we didn't like that in the United States. I was sent down as one of several economic hitmen to change Roldos, to corrupt him, to bring him around, to let him know, okay, you can get very rich, you and your family, if you play our game, but if you continue to try to keep these policies you've promised, you're going to go. You wouldn't listen. He was assassinated. As soon as the plane crashed, the whole area was cordoned off. The only people alive in the U.S. military from a nearby base, and some of the Ecuadorian military. When an investigation was launched, two of the key witnesses died in car accidents before they had a chance to testify. A lot of very, very strange things that went on around the assassination of Jaime Roldos. I, like most people who've really looked at this case, have absolutely no doubt that it was an assassination. And of course, in my position as an economic hitman, I was always expecting something to happen to Jaime, whether it be a coup or assassination. I wasn't sure, but that he would be taken down because he was not being corrupted. He would not allow himself to be corrupted the way we wanted to corrupt him. He was very charismatic. He was a guy who really wanted to help his country. And when
Hey. Be nice. What's your problem?
The Swedish inventor of the microchip that's designed to go into people's arms, things like that. That's a conspiracy theory. No, this is actually being reported in mainstream media now. There's that time gap between the conspiracy and reality that is about a few months now. This is the next one. Anyway, the Swedish inventor behind that, a guy named Hans Joblad, I think that's how you pronounce it. Why do these people always sound like baddies from Die Hard? Anyway, he said that this is going to be rolled out, whether you like it or not. And this is the video I shared previously. Now, this was actually taken down and called misinformation on this platform. I appealed it and it was put back up because it's literally taken from mainstream media. Literally taken from mainstream media, so they reinstated it after an appeal. I'm sure many people are happy to roll up their sleeves. It sounds like people have already started doing that and have been doing it in places like Sweden. But me, my sleeves are going to remain down. Why? Because I can see past next week. Ta-ta.
As billionaires and big tech increasingly take over agriculture and the food we eat, we ask, are we being turned into a genetically modified food colony? Hello there, you 4.5 billion twinkling wonders. If you're in the UK between January and May, come and see me on tour. You can see me in the south of England, places like the Hammersmith Apollo. I'm in Margate, Aylesbury, Ipswich, all sorts of places like that. But that's as long as you're healthy enough to sustain the sweet gift of life for that long, because the food we eat increasingly is becoming a problem. This piece was written by the philosopher, academic, and friend of the show, particularly Under the Skin, Brad Evans, the professor. Let's see what he's got to say. The world is in the grip of a dangerous food crisis. This is about more than simply food chains. It raises fundamental questions about food dependency and the very types of foodstuffs that will be available for us to eat in the coming decades. In a recent article in the Lancet Medical Journal, researchers noted how we're entering into a troubled period as far as access to food is concerned. Citing a 2021 global report on food crisis, they point out how over 160 million people in 43 countries around the world are affected by food shortages. Sometimes when we do these stories, I think we're dealing with philosophical ideas like freedom and liberty. When we start dealing with food, like the sustenance of life, because of course it's understood that the reason we contemplate the meaning of freedom, what kind of politics we want, why society is becoming so fragmented, is because we have food and shelter in the main. I know there is such a thing as poverty. I'm not 5 years old, but now food itself, one of the fundamental components of our sustenance, is under threat. But this is not just a problem confined to the world's poorest countries. In the United States, according to the Department of Agriculture data, some 13.8 million people, roughly 10% of the population, faced some kind of food insecurity in the last year. The situation is the same in the United Kingdom. Wait, I live there. As B. Wilson recently noted in The Guardian, COVID has brought to the surface some hard truths about the British food system and what a poor job it does of feeding the population as a whole. As the first lockdown hit in March 2020, plenty of better off British households were able to carry on eating much as before, while millions were plunged into food poverty. Food shortages, that's for telephones. That's for me to phone in and donate £5 to Comic Relief or whatever it is that year. Now, food shortages, as a result of the pandemic and the wealth transfer and power grab that's taken place during this period, are going to be affecting millions, maybe even billions more people. Poverty and starvation is coming to a city near you. Well, it seems the multinational food corporations have a ready-made solution, which also reveals some interesting connections with vaccine production. Nothing to worry about there then, because vaccine production is one of the least controversial issues in modern times. While debates still rage over the extent to which the COVID vaccine amounts to genetic modification, what's perhaps less known is how it's borrowed some of its ideas from the marketing strategies for genetically modified or transgenic food. Moreover, what has marked a notable difference was how vaccine production was able to bypass several regulations that were in place, which previously limited the widespread roll out of genetically engineered foods. Could this now be used as a catalyst to open the floodgates as food producers demand the same loosening of rules? What does seem clear is how the success of the vaccine is now presented by some as a new way to overcome public concerns with GM foods. I think what Brad Evans is saying is that because COVID vaccines have been rushed through in order to meet the necessary demand to deal with the consequences of this pandemic and the medical crisis, that the same regulation, legislation, or lack thereof could now be applied to food production. You can see that way that sort of stuff rolls out. Any new precedent that's set around the distribution of a product that previously would have been regarded with some circumspection is foreboding, because now there has been a precedent set. So down the road, we can make food in this way, we can roll out products in this way, because whatever you think about what's going on with the COVID vaccine and the regulations around it, you can see that there are, shall we say, symbiotic relationships between government, big business, big pharma, regulatory bodies that advance a shared agenda. Even if that shared agenda, even if you're of the opinion that shared agenda is get people vaccinated because that's what's necessary in order to save lives, they've worked collegiately in order to pursue that end, if that's the end you believe that they're pursuing. If this is true, it could be argued that what's happening now is that big government, in partnership with corporations, is beginning to over-regulate your freedom while under-regulating the processes, checks and balances that usually ensure that big businesses can't introduce products into the marketplace that could or may be harmful. An article in the Irish Times noted a few months ago, environmental groups opposed to genetically modified organisms, GMOs, have been very influential for a considerable time and capable of raising large public protests. But the anti-GMO movement is now in decline as the EU and various influential environmental organisations begin to cautiously welcome selected genetically engineered organisms. The final nail in the anti-GMO coffin is likely to be the spectacular success of the genetic technology that has just developed several highly effective vaccines against COVID-19 within the miraculously short time frame of 1 year. The same article also points out how biotechnology techniques can help the EU to meet environmental sustainability goals. For those of us who are concerned with the food we eat and believe in the benefit of organically grown crops, this is a troubling development. So if you believe that the vaccines are a success, and of course many people do, then a precedent is being set for genetically modified products. And if you are also a person that believes that food shouldn't be genetically modified, I always feel weird when I think I live in the countryside, I see crops getting sprayed and stuff, and this doesn't feel right when you see stuff get sprayed in the sun. It's just stuff that jars and feels unusual. It feels to me, intuitively, that we should eat food that grows somewhat naturally. And I know there will be some obstreperous argumentative people, well, why don't you not use tools at all then? Or do you resent Jethro Tull for his seed drill? It's like, no, it's weird how the GMO conversation has sort of disappeared, hasn't it? That used to be something we were always on about. Be careful, is that GM modified? I don't want that GM modified. No one's talking about that anymore. It's gone away. Why? When considering the issue of food dependency, and who among us needs food? There are certain issues, aren't there, that sometimes remind you you're on a planet with other people that are basically the same as you. We're continually fetishizing our differences of our nations and our races and our creeds and our genders and our sexes, and we're all got these quirks and peculiarities, and this is the age of the individual. But if we have a problem with food, no one's getting away with that. When considering this issue of food dependency and the attempts to impose genetically modified foods, it's worth looking at countries already embroiled in the fight. Let's take the example of Mexico, which is particularly instructive. The farmers of the country have been actively organising against GMO foods for many years, and they were integral to getting the issue at the forefront of the international activist agenda, at least since the protests in Seattle back in 2000. Key here is maize or corn. Also, Van Damme Shiva, a friend of the show's continually instructing us, advising us, educating us about what's happening in Indian farming, where the influence of Bill Gates, Monsanto, other massive organisations, patenting seeds, altering seeds, preventing seeds from reseeding. It's just a sort of a nightmare over there. And this is, of course, a global problem because it's a globalist agenda. Corn production in Mexico is not just highly politicized, its production goes to the heart of indigenous cultures. We might recall here how a key feature of the Zapatista uprising in Mexico in 1994 was the autonomy and dignity of native food crops, which in turn led to the creation of what was called the anti-globalization movement. But it has also been the most ferociously fought over battleground in the push to impose genetically modified variants, which quite literally displaced native crops with a corn variant that colonizes the land and displaces its multicolored variants with a mass-produced yellow variety. They're always doing that, and I bet when they're doing it, going, "We've come to help you with your corn. We have been growing corn for many, many thousands of years now. We've noticed you're doing it wrong. Have this type of corn. It don't grow again next year. You'll have to give us some more money." Mexico currently boasts 64 types of corn, which are used in over 600 different food dishes. Yet, as Gabriela Galdino noted in Politico, Mexico is rapidly turning into the main battleground in a cultural and commercial war over how the world grows its food, notably in resistance to US demands. What's at stake here is the way food production is taking direct aim at people's political rights for autonomy. GM, in short, is now, like the vaccine, proposing to be a way to save us from another catastrophe as it allows us to feed the world. Now, this is something I think many of us are concerned about, regardless of our opinions around the vaccine, its efficacy, the conduct of pharmaceutical companies, is the idea that salvation will come from a kind of elite class, a group of billionaires who, using technological ingenuity, will solve the world's problems. When sort of, I feel like many of the world's problems have been caused by this kind of colonization. Vandana Shiva is very clear that she believes this simply to be another wave of colonization, posing as a solution. This conveniently comes at a time when people have been making notable shifts in food consumption patterns, demanding fairer production and insisting more on their organic nature. Yeah, that's true. We were beginning to wake up, even though I recognise it was sort of expensive, mostly for well-off people. We prefer organic stuff. Is that organic? Is that organic? It's all over here. But now there's a sort of slow, insidious advance of the GM agenda being pushed with a move that, no matter what else you think it is undoubtedly globalist. One of the most famous voices on food insecurity remains Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. Importantly for Sen, if people are suffering from food insecurity, it's hardly ever due to a shortage of food, but what he called a lack of entitlement. In short, there's enough healthy food available to feed the planet. What we lack is the correct political and economic distributions. A sentence like that, an idea like that, shows us how ridiculous the world has become. There is enough food. There's no need for poverty. There's no need for hunger. There are enough resources, but we have mapped onto actual material reality an ideology which creates inequality, which centralizes resources and generates and requires the generation of poverty. And what does it always claim it is? This is just pragmatism. This is the most materialist, practical, rational way of doing stuff. But it might as well be like some system of believing in fairies. It's imaginary. It isn't real. And if it's not working, you have to examine it. Could it be that our solution to this global food crisis is not biotech engineering, but a type of engineering that's far more human? One that involves a simple redistribution in income so people can live a healthy life. If we are what we eat, then surely we should fight back against foods that colonize us. What a fantastic piece of writing by Brad Evans. Note how it aligns with much of the stuff that Vandana Shiva says. Note how it shows how the agenda around one political issue, the COVID vaccines and their rollout, aligns and supports an agenda that would easily coalesce with the imperatives that might underwrite, health issues aside, the aforementioned. But that's just what I think, and evidently what Brad Evans thinks. What do you think? We make this content for you, so let us know what you think in the comments below. Give us a thumbs up, subscription, turn on the notification bell. If you enjoyed this video, why not have a look at this one with Vandana, where she explains in depth how she sees it from an Indian perspective. If you want to learn more about meditation, sign up to my Awakening Side channel, and please join my mailing list as well, so I can communicate with you weekly. If you're in the UK between January and May, we'll do some fantastic shows in early February. There's a link in the description. Stay free.
A lot of people in the nursing homes, you could do some therapy with, right? And I would see over and over again what's plaguing this person, right? You know, trauma from 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And if we don't go back and look at that, we carry with us
The School of Greatness. Please welcome Miss House.
Like, it's hard for
understand trauma. It's hard for them to understand it. It's hard for them to deal with the shame behind it, and then how to heal the trauma. So I want to unpack some of this.
Yeah.
But I wanted to set the stage for this conversation because you've been doing this work for 20-ish years.
Yes.
And why did you decide to talk about trauma in this way? And what have you seen from your experience on how it impacts people in the negative way if it's not dealt with properly?
Yeah. I didn't set out to be a trauma person, to focus on trauma. But as I gained more and more experience, I thought, wow, look, this is an undercurrent of almost everything I'm doing.
Everything. Right? Give me an example.
So there's depression, anxiety, panic attacks, sleep problems, even addiction problems, even psychosis, right? Like trauma pushing people to a point where there's a predisposition to not be able to cope with reality, but it's the trauma that sends the person over the edge. Or triggering bipolar episodes. So if you think about the more severe mental health problems, right, all the way through to problems that have a scale of severity, right, depression, anxiety, and then certainly trauma pushing and promoting abusive substances, drugs and alcohol, and addiction, which then of course furthers trauma, right? So I started seeing, hey, it kind of doesn't matter really what I'm engaging with someone about, right? More often than not, there's an undercurrent of trauma that unless that's thought about and addressed, we're kind of like polishing the hood, right? When we need to get under the hood and really get into the engine, right? And there's a mental health system that loves polishing the hood, right? Like a lot of things we do in life in this country now, we kind of want to spruce things up and make them look a certain way and not look at what's really going on underneath the surface. And then I started seeing that this sort of reflexive creation of shame when a person suffers trauma, the sort of immediacy of that sense of shame and the response to it to keep everything inside, right?
Is not communicate about it.
Right.
Why do we not want to communicate about the shame that we have? Why is that so hard for us?
Well, there's the shame itself. Like shame is synonymous with the message of like, you must keep this secret, right? And if shame is evoked, so if it's in a reflexive way created by trauma, in the vast majority of circumstances, I believe that to be true because I've seen that play out in front of me over 20 years, that the reflexive shame is in and of itself a message of secrecy, right? And that's why, as you were saying at the beginning, right, that people are carrying burdens around with them, and you can look from the outside and tell that this person has achieved this, and this person has achieved that, and what we see from the outside is so often not at all reflective of what's going on the inside. And part of the wonderful privilege of being a psychiatrist and consulting to people through the psychiatric lens is you get to learn like what's on the inside, and then you see a commonality that I've seen across the whole socioeconomic spectrum, across like any different factor you can identify, right? This is present in people across that spectrum.
Yeah. What would you say is the percentage, rough estimate, of people in America that have experienced some type of trauma in their life?
You have to stratify by severity, right?
Okay.
And if you can say, okay, we can identify, like trauma is negatively impactful in that person's life, and we can take stock of it and describe it. I think we're well over half the population. We just have to be. The clinical work bears it out. The statistics bear it out, right?
Mental health challenges, yeah.
Right, I figure 1 in 4 women suffering from sexual assault, right? 1 in 6 men. I mean, so that's one aspect of trauma, and we're already up to 20-25% of people, right? So then there's the fact that trauma just pervades the environment we all live in, right? I mean, we experience it vicariously. We look at the news, which is now really more, it's more marketing, right? Like
trauma marketing. Yeah, trauma marketing.
Right. It's repetitive, incessant trauma marketing. Look at what could happen to you. Look at what could happen to your kids. Look at what could happen to anyone around you, right? Over and over and over again. And you combine that with the political strife in the country, the worries about terrorism, and we're living kind of like this. We're living in it with a sense of very much escalated tension. And so I think it pervades the whole world around us. And so I think in that way, we're all subject to it. I mean, I don't know anyone who
doesn't know someone closely or intimately that has identifiable significant trauma. So in that way, it does affect
all of us. Yeah. What are the common, if you could talk about the theme of all the people that come to you, what would you say are like the 5 to 7 main reasons they come to you? Maybe it's not what's under the hood, but the main things that come to you. Is it stress, anxiety? Is it, depression? What are the main kind of themes that you're seeing consistently?
Yeah. What people mostly present with is just a sense of angst, a sense of frustration. Like sometimes a person will present and say, well, I have depression, right? And they may know that because maybe they do have very clearly delineated cyclical depressive episodes, right? Or they've been diagnosed with depression, right? But when people present kind of de novo, I'm like, well, I don't care what your diagnoses are, right? Let's just talk about like what's going on in you. Like why did you come in, right? Then what people talk is that sense of angst inside of them, right? The sense that something isn't right, right? And if they've checked a lot of boxes, right, then we have an expectation, right, that if I'm doing the right things, right, and I have a good stable career, right, and I have a good roof over my head, and everyone's healthy around me, like I should feel good, right? And that was part of my own challenges where like I saw that develop even in myself, where I started to develop an anger and a resentment that I don't feel good, even though I've worked hard enough to check all of these boxes. So I think even in those situations, let alone how many people are struggling with financial insecurity, occupational insecurity, housing insecurity. And so you add that on top of it, and we just keep raising and raising and raising the level of tension, which then of course propagates and perpetuates trauma. The thought of it as an epidemic, predates the pandemic. Like that we started writing this and thinking about it that way a long time ago, with the idea that we don't know this is here and it's spreading from one of us to another and back, and we're not aware.
It's invisible.
Yeah.
But it's spreading quickly, and it constantly stays with us. Like you were writing in the book about how just because an event happened in the past 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago doesn't mean it's not still carrying with you today until you address it, until you start to really process the integrating of healing, right?
Right. I saw that over and over again. Maybe, it was probably 17, 18 years ago. I covered about a dozen nursing homes along the seaboard of Massachusetts, and a lot of people in the nursing homes, you could do some therapy with, right? And I would see over and over again what's plaguing this person, right? And they trauma from 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago that was so fresh and alive, as if it had happened yesterday or last week, yet it could be a half a century ago. And that struck me so strongly that we tuck these things away inside of us, and then they're sort of sealed in us. And if we don't go back and look at them, we carry with us the burdens, which are often burdens of shame. Right, they're burdens of self-blame, they're burdens of inadequacy, and unless we go back and look at that, we don't challenge those lessons, right? Like trauma teaches us these terrible lessons, and then we just hide it away, and then it becomes immutable, right? There's no way of then going and accessing and saying, well, what's actually true about that? Right? What do you actually believe about that? And how many people have told me about something so very clearly traumatic done to them, right? So walking down the street, they're attacked, right? And they talk about it through the lens of shame, right? That it was their fault. It shows that they're not a worthwhile person. They can't really make the way in the world. They can't keep themselves safe. No one will ever like them, right? No one will ever care for them. And like these lessons are there for years and years about something. Once you start talking about it and unpacking it, they logically know there's no shame to feel, right? But the logic doesn't matter if the emotion is telling us something different,
right? Now, if we go through a traumatic experience and we hold on to this shame, can it change our biology, our genes? Does it, what's it do to the chemistry in our brain, to our heart? What does it do to us physically?
What is so amazing is we have proof of things that even like 20 years ago, if one had said, trauma can change the genes that you pass on, right? Not necessarily maybe the actual gene itself or whether it's active or not, which makes all the difference, right? If you have it and it's not active, you may as well not have it, right? If you don't have it, that's the same as like you got a good gene, right? But now it's not turned on, right? And the thought that like how we genetically present, right, what's going on inside of us can be impacted by trauma that happened years before conception would have sounded crazy, right? So someone who is deeply traumatized, you look at like, rape as a tool of warfare, right? And the thought having been that there's it's a crime committed on one day by one person against another, right? That narrow conception doesn't even begin to touch what actually happens. That person is, without the right intervention, likely changed for the rest of their lives.
Wow.
And if they have a child 5 years later, right, the genes that are active in that child are changed as a result of the trauma.
Really?
And these, like, it sounds shocking. And I interviewed Darren Richard, who's a friend of mine and an academic psychiatrist who's done a lot of the work around this. And he speaks to me so eloquently that yes, what's going on here is not, that crime happened on that day, but that trauma is transgenerational.
Wow.
And it impacts us from head to toe. It impacts our cardiovascular health, so therefore our risk of heart attack, our risk of stroke, our risk of autoimmune diseases. So it's not theoretical and esoteric, right? It impacts us from head to toe. And we know that now. We have the physical proof of it, which is in ways like very gratifying, right? As opposed to like making assertions like this even a decade ago or closer to 20 years ago, when you couldn't really get any traction. It's what's esoteric. It's something that the person looks the same, so like they're still okay, right? And like,
just suck it up. And it was 20 years ago, so let it go or whatever.
Right.
What was a trauma that was extremely hard for you to heal, or that took you the longest to kind of overcome? And does it still impact you today, or is there hope for us that, hey, if you go through something traumatic, there are ways to heal so it doesn't have to impact you in a negative way for the rest of your life?
Yeah, I think there's definitely hope for that. And since you'd asked about me, my brother's suicide when I was in my early 20s was so dramatically impactful on me, on my family, and at the time I was very fortunate. I knew nothing about mental health. I was in an entirely different career field, and I was fortunate to have good people around me, like it was really good, supportive people, and that helped get me through it. And the knowledge that maybe I should get some help, right? Like no one really got therapy. It was an interesting, strange thing to do, right? It was, there's this helping resource there. And it was immensely helpful.
Yeah.
To just, someone just asking me, well, how do you feel about that? And at the sense of like, I feel doomed, I feel ashamed, I feel despondent. And that doesn't lead a person to good places, right? That leads a person to depression, to self-destruction, to drugs and alcohol, and even just having some basic help like that helped me like stay on track, right? And then as time has gone on and I've accumulated more really significant traumas since then. In the first half of my life, I didn't have major trauma.
Really?
And then sort of the second half, I've had a bunch of major trauma. And being able to sort of see it through that lens of like, oh, I just naturally felt differently, right? I had a different view of the world. There's a place where I could make myself felt and seen and I could impact and like good things would come to me. Like I had a whole set of beliefs that then really changed. Really, it changed in a way that made me feel much more defensive of the world and afraid of the world. And it was really getting very, very good psychotherapy in that second part of my life. So I went to medical school and started training as a psychiatrist and started really getting good therapy. That I realized, yes, this doesn't have to control your life, but it is a struggle, right? Like it's on my mind. It's an active part of my self-care and my psychotherapy, and sometimes use of medicines. So I have to actively really take care of myself to maintain a perspective where I'm aware that it's there, but it's not, in a sense, pulling the wool over my eyes and telling me things that can really lead us down a path of, sometimes a path of destruction, but other times just a path of sadness and sort of despondency and not living up to what we want to be, not just career-wise, but interpersonally, like the kind of parent I want to be and the kind of husband and friend. And I think with a real awareness of like, yeah, I'm laboring against this, right? Then it doesn't have to control me. And I found that in so many of the people that I take care of. Yeah. I found that to be true.
Wow. So the first half of your life, pretty happy, normal, healthy lifestyle. no major traumas. Second half, a bunch of major traumas, it sounds like, starting with a suicide to your brother. Where do you think you would be without having healing therapeutic modalities to process over the second half of your life? Where do you think your life would be, if you can think about it?
I think I'm not in a good place.
Really?
And I don't know exactly what that means. Like one worry would be the specter of depression, which runs in me and runs in the family, and I could see getting lost in that in a way that then narrows one's horizons, and that promotes frustration and anger, and at times even bitterness in people, and it can lead us away from just like being a good person in the world, right?
Yeah.
You become more isolated from care and concern to or from other people, and then I think it's a very small step from that to abuse of substances. I mean, they're just so there in front of us to say, you feel awful, right? And you feel awful and angry and frustrated and an injustice about feeling awful, right? Don't you want to soothe? You can soothe this now. Don't you deserve that now? Like, it's a self-seduction, but it's a self-seduction that leads so many of us to a path of like short-term healing at the expense of the long-term of our lives.
Is almost all addiction stemming from some type of shame based on a trauma, would you say? Or can addiction happen from other ways?
I think addiction can happen in other ways, especially their genetic components to how we respond to certain substances. And there can be substances that are, some of them for everyone, like opiates, are so powerful that it probably doesn't matter what our genetic predispositions are. Like that can get the best of any of us,
really?
Right? By creating such euphoria followed by such withdrawal from that euphoria, right? That there are substances that can just take a hold of us, no matter what our state of health is, right? But there are also then genetic predispositions of one person to another of what we may be exceptionally vulnerable to. So substances, I think, can essentially have a life of their own and creating problems in us. But that being said, the vast majority of dysfunction I see in people, whether it's substances or it's acting out against the self, it may be self-harm, right, physically, or it may be just keeping a sort of sadistic accounting in our minds, right?
Like what?
Of well, I'm not doing well enough in life, so like you don't get to go do that, right? You don't get to do that enjoyable thing, or
you don't deserve it. Yeah.
Right? You don't deserve to like have a good meal tonight, right? You don't deserve to get enough rest, right? You don't deserve to like go out with that person who might really be a really good partner, right? Like this sense of like there being an accounting inside of us that oppresses us. We've known for many years, in my field, people thought about people a lot more like 100 years ago, right? Because we didn't have the advancements we have, which in many ways are wonderful, right? But we think less about people, and this idea.
We think less about like how other people are doing. Is that what you mean, or what do you mean?
No, we think less, like in my field, we think less about like, okay, if you're my patient, what's going on in you? Like, how do you feel about life, right? And what are the dynamics of that? We've stepped away from that in very much a polish the hood kind of way. Well, whatever's going on with you, like your insurance authorizes 10 sessions of CBT, and you'll get that, and you'll take a medicine, then you're going to be better, or you will have failed the intervention, right? Like, that's not helpful in most cases. And when people thought more about other people, they thought about ideas like, for example, there's no internal victim without an internal persecutor, right? Which I don't mean like feeling victimized, like somebody steals your wallet, you're like, oh, I'm a victim, I fill out a report, right? But the idea that, no, I'm a victim. I stand out as a mark to people, right? That if people are looking for someone to hurt in a relationship, they're going to look to me. People are looking to someone to abuse and bully around, whether it's on the playground or it's in the office, right? It's going to be me, right? When people think like that, they also internalize the persecutor, right? There doesn't need. I've worked with people who are still in their minds being actively persecuted by someone who's been dead for 20 years. Right? Because that person doesn't need to be alive anymore because they're doing it to themselves. And we can get like that. In fact, I think the internal dialogue in us that can say, oh, what an awful person, or, you're never going to get anywhere, and how stupid, right? Like, how many of us have that going on inside of us? And that arises from trauma
And it blinds us to like, look, who am I? Who do I want to be in the world? What do I have to offer? Like, how are you going to make the best of that? If there's a running dialogue in your mind, say we should just mess that up again. And like, that's present in so many of us.
Is there a way around trauma? Like, I grew up thinking to myself a lot, like, you're stupid, you're never going to amount to anything. Like, saying these things internally all the time as a child in, like, elementary school, not knowing why I was doing it, but I just kept doing it. You know, I didn't have the tools to heal, and there wasn't, when I was growing up in the 80s, early 90s, there wasn't models of, you know, grown men that I could look to on TV or athletes or whatever who were openly talking about their emotions, talking about traumas, talking about here's what you should do to heal if you've been hurt or something.
Right.
And so I felt like I had to stuff it in until I turned 30. And then I started to realize, wow, I've accomplished all these external things, but feel like something's still missing.
Right.
So I feel like, why am I not fulfilled? Why am I not peaceful?
Right.
And then I went on a journey for many years of healing and letting go of the shame. And as my therapist says now, healing is not an event. It's not a one-time moment where you're like, I'm healed because I talked about it. It's a journey.
Yes.
It's a process of integration.
Yes.
Is there a way to go around trauma to just shine the hood and be okay? Or do you feel like the only way is to go to the core root of it and deal with the process of healing?
Yeah. I think the only way is to go to the root of it and try and heal that core process. I mean, sometimes, you know, there are always outlying situations, right, where you know, a person can polish the hood a little bit, go on with their life and like have things be okay. But that's
functional, but not like
Right, that's the rarity, though, and I've seen over and over and over again that it festers inside of us, and some people are blessed with sort of resilience gene. Like, you know, people have thought about this since the Second World War. Like, well, why did some people like survive concentration camps? Right? Why were some people able to like still see hope, right? Still persevere, still be resilient, right? And there are some genetics around that we just don't understand well. And if a person is blessed with that, then when like you feel despairing, then what you may do is something that seems productive or positive in the outside world, right? That you do in order to get some like legitimate feeling of something good, right? And it may be that you have that gene, right? You have the genetics for that, right? And I think I have the genetics for that, right? And those are blessings, right? Like, we don't want to count on, like, I have a gene for resilience, so you know I didn't drink my life away after my brother's suicide, right? Like, we don't want to rely on that, because if a person has enough resilience, you can get yourself maybe to where you found yourself at 30, where like, oh, wait, I've achieved a lot, and then something inside says, wait, is all that really true about me? Right? Because if I really am this like awful person, like how did I do this? And then you can have a greater breadth of perspective. And then what you probably started doing for yourself then was reconstructing a narrative. Yes. Right? And that's why the construction of the story narrative. Yeah. Right. Really, wait, is that story true? Mm-hmm. Right? Because it's gotten a pass. Right? Like, it's gotten a pass. And I see people for years and years and years, the story of, you know, why they're not worth anything, right, has just come forward without any challenge, right? But when if you start helping them talk about it and think about it, like, you know, a lot of times I'll say, well, look, from what you're telling me, there's some shame to be had in this story, but it sounds like it's not yours. Right? And that's the case in the case of acute trauma, right? We can look at, so somebody hurt you, right? And then you can start thinking, well, but you feel ashamed, right? Like, how does that work inside? Like, why does it work that way, right? Like, why do we have this reflexive shame? And like, where do you actually want that to go, right? Or do you feel anger or frustration about it, right? And people know, and often when people don't, how do you not feel that, right? It's just that it's coming back in towards them. And then you say, well, what is it like? What do you say to yourself when you wake up in the morning, when you're driving in the car? I remember working with someone who was driving this really long drive to work. And I learned as part of working with her that she loved music, loved listening to music. And then like, it just came up that she never turned the music on in the car.
Why not?
I'm like, well, it was going on a long drive, right? Because she didn't want to block the narrative in her head.
The negative narrative.
Right, the negative narrative that was like, you're worth nothing. Because there was in her mind justified, right? That was the justifiable self-punishment What? For being hurt by other people, right? And when we unpack that, we're like, wow.
And how long do we hold on to that punishment for?
Potentially forever, unless we go in and look at it. So the first prescription I wrote was turn music on in car, right? And then as she became more aware, she's like, right, there's like a whole story in my head. And that's what it plays over and over and over again. And it plays over in that summarized manner. You're not worth anything. No one will ever love you, right? And, the reason this person comes to mind, there's a lot of people like this whose lives have really, really changed. Once you're like, wait, that's actually not my story, right? And logic tells me something different, but logic has not one thing to say about it. It's all been through emotion. So let's talk about that emotion, reconstruct the narrative, and then it's remarkable how much better things can get, because it's not a hocus pocus, right? It's away from like the black magic hocus pocus towards what's actually true. There's a simplicity to it, and that's why the book is designed to be very practical, right? It's not designed to be an academic treatise. It's designed to say, like, we can make this better now, and we can start making it better right now by just saying, what's going on in my head? What am I saying to myself? What's going on in the people around me? Someone who may be a little different, I don't know why, or a little different after something difficult. How can I talk with them, right? Like, there's so much that we can do when we become more and more isolated in society. We're busy, we're running around, we're at odds with each other in lots and lots of ways that are politically or socially driven. And then we're so isolated that we never challenge these narratives. And that was like the amazing thing that I saw with such sadness in the doing nursing home work so many years ago. It's like there's so many people are carrying with them the trauma of so many years ago, and it's just as alive as it was in then, when it happened. And it's been, in a sense, the pivotal force of how their life is going forward. I mean, not everyone, but there was a lot of that.
You were mentioning how, there's a narrative that we say, I'm not lovable, I'll never be good enough, or I don't deserve this. What would you say are the three biggest lies we tell ourselves? Maybe that you hear from people when they come into your office. What would those three big lies be?
Yeah, I think you said, I'm not lovable, right? I'm not good enough. I don't deserve. Right.
Yeah.
Right, so the thing that what not lovable means, right, is that there's something, I'm intrinsically flawed, right? I mean, to say one is not lovable, it's such a blanket statement of persecution, right? You think about what it would be like saying that outwardly to someone, right? But you're just making a blanket statement, you are not lovable, right? I mean, it's awful, right? And it's why the persecutor inside of us can say things to us that, like, people outside of us, generally don't, right? We wouldn't tolerate from other people. Like, how dare one say, everybody's going on inside of our minds. And that's the practical shift of that is like the I'm not good enough, right? Because if I'm not lovable as an intrinsic characteristic, then that translates, well, I'm not good enough to do what I set out to do, right? I'm not good enough to achieve whatever that may be. And then, yes, and then of course one isn't deserving, right? I mean, if all that is true, then you're not deserving of anything. Like, think about blanket statements, right? And I think the proof of, like, why do I think for sure that this is true? Like, psychiatry isn't math, right? But maybe it's because I was a math minor. Way back then, I love mathematical proof of things, right? Is I've seen more people than I could possibly count who I know them personally, professionally, they're people in my life, and I see them before trauma and after, right? And sometimes I marvel at how not only do they think about themselves entirely different, but they don't know that they thought any differently before.
I think they've always been thinking this way.
Yeah, I've never been good enough.
Wow.
Right? It's always been true, but no one's ever loved me. What do you mean? Like, before the trauma, you had like a great job and friends and a wonderful girlfriend. It's like things were great before, but they don't, because the consequences of trauma change our memories, right? Like, our memories only have meaning through the emotion that's attached to them. Interesting, right? So if you change memories and now there's a negative spin on it, you can say, well, what about, I can remember a person who would tell me about some award, I think it was high school or early in college, like something to feel really proud of. And I would talk about that and like anchor to that of like, hey, that says like I can do things, right? Who then on the other side of the trauma remembered that in a very negative way. Of, something was given to me I didn't deserve, and
I got lucky or whatever.
Yeah, and it showed like it didn't mean anything. Like all it did was make pressure on me I could never live up to, and now so there's an explanation for like avoiding a better job, right? Or from going from a lousy relationship partner and even an abusive one to someone who could be better. Like why would you do that if you have an expectation of failure? And if the expectation of failure is based on the false lessons of trauma, well, we have very powerful examples of what this does to us. We forget our own things.
So memories have meaning through the emotions attached to them. Is that right?
Yes.
It's so true. And if you have a memory, it sounds like what I'm hearing you say, if you have a memory of the past that could be a good event for many years, and then you go through a trauma, somehow you reconnect it to that event or whatever, you can completely shift your emotions toward that event to being a negative experience.
Right. Crazy. But it really is, and like this is I think like shocking. Some people ask me, like, what's like shocking things you've learned, like being a psychiatrist? And that may be the top of the list, but it's certainly near the top of the list. Our own histories are malleable entitlements. And people have brought up a couple times, like I write examples of it, right? And there's a railway station in London, right? St. Pancras, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it in which way, but it sounds like pancreas, right? And like I love England. I spent some time in college in England, and I love being in England. I love being in London. And I was walking to meet a friend at the St. Pancras rail station, right? And you think that's like it should be a joyful thing. And as I'm walking there, I felt awful. I felt terrible, and I felt like, what am I doing here? And I deserve to be here. And let me see my friend. Why is my friend like? I felt so terrible, really, about myself. And then I realized 100% like what that was. Is my mother died of pancreatic cancer.
Oh,
and
wow.
Pancreas sounds a lot like pancreas, and like it was that realization of like that's absolutely what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking, what a person, you didn't go home enough when your mom was sick, and I'm thinking all these things in my mind, and I realized like so my memory of like what that place was evoking in me had changed, right? And it changed my feeling, and I needed to use it. Can we get better? We can, but we have to have it in my head. Like I need to stop and think. Like, look, these are different things, right? You're triggered. You feel something. I'm feeling that you feel that way. You're happy to be here, and you think you did a decent job as a good son when your mother was sick. You actually believe that, and you can't wait to see this person. You can't wait to see you either. It's like I took the train down from London, and I could feel differently about it, but there's a lot of like work on that, right? To not just be carried away to some very negative feeling state where my self-talk went strongly along with the negative feelings.
How do we, let's say we don't have a therapist who are, as a resource for us. We don't have the funds, or for whatever reason, we're not comfortable doing that yet, which I'm a big fan of. I love therapy. What can someone do if they realize, I'm feeling some of these lies or these symptoms of angst, frustration, depression. Maybe I'm using a substance already. Maybe I'm addicted to something. Maybe I'm in denial that I'm addicted to something. Whatever it may be, or just feeling depressed or depressed feelings.
Yes.
What are some practical things that people can do on their own before they go and start processing with a trained professional?
Yeah, really, it's such a good question, right? Because like not everyone has access to that, and certainly it's not something we can get immediately, even if we have access to, right? And I would give two very strong answers to that: of to stop and think, hey, what's going on inside of me, and we take what's going on inside of us as a given. That woman who drove 50 minutes to work and back every day, and then turned the radio on so she could say awful things to herself, never thought once about it until that offhand comment about why there's no music in the car. Right, wait a second. Right now, for the first time, she thinks about it. Right. So what is actually going on inside of me, which is really closely tied to the second point, which is what's my narrative about myself and my life, and like what do I actually think? It's going back and looking at the things that we now take as a given. Right. And if you think trauma so predisposes to that. I mean, trauma is not a thing, but I would say trauma loves that, right? Because then we don't go back and look at it. We just take all that off us. Well, that's a given. That's that. And now, here I am. It's like, that's not a given. It's not, that's that, right? We can go look at what's going on inside of me. What's the narrative I'm constructing? And that can be very, very helpful to people who have no access outside resources. And if you can find one trusted person, right, you can just talk to about it. Once you start doing that, if you can just sit with somebody, friend, family, clergy, doesn't matter, somebody that's trusted, because we have error checking mechanisms inside of us that we don't use when we're thinking, but we use when we're talking. Right? And that's like putting it, it's amazing how many times I said that. And now I feel totally different, even though I thought about it 10,000 times. I feel that all the time. So start putting words with writing, writing about it, speaking about it to someone else, even speaking about it to ourselves, right? Putting it into words, then we bring our whole brain online.
How important is it what we think and what we say to and about ourselves on a daily basis?
It's hugely important. Right. It's hugely important. So you think when I was a kid, people would talk about, well, that's the soup you're swimming in, right? It was just a turn of phrase, right? And like that is the soup that we're swimming in, the environment that we're in. A lot of it does come from outside, but not as much as comes from inside, right? So it's absolutely affecting us all day, every day, which is I think is how we can perpetuate over years and years and years the trauma inside of us. Because you think, why don't our brains? I mean, our brains are very sophisticated in a lot of ways. Why don't we go back and do some inventory? Right? Reboot the system and look at everything in the past. Why don't we do that? It's like constantly being in a hurricane, right? Like, you're just like trying to survive in the hurricane, right? But you give a person a little bit of peace. Like, okay, I now can think about that, whereas I couldn't before. So I think it's immensely important, and I've seen that play out clinically, really, over and over and over. Like, that person doesn't realize they're living in a hurricane, and it's coming from in here, and they've been struggling with it. And they might say something, well, can't be from that. That was 15 years ago. Like, some people would look at me like, what do you think? That was 20 years ago. It's not affecting me now. But then as we look through it, it's affected them every day from then until now. And that's the last story in the book speaks to that, right? It speaks to someone whose life changed so much by being able to realize, like, no, that thing from 20 years ago has absolutely been oppressing me every single day since then, and I don't want that to be the case anymore. I want to look at that and say, is it true? Should I feel that way? And if I do, I'll keep doing it. But I'm gonna give myself the chance of looking at it anew.
Yes.
Whole life is different.
And so, asking yourself what's going on inside of me and what's my narrative about myself, the first two things that we should be doing. I mean, is that what would happen if you go to a therapist? It'd be essentially going through that process as well. And then how could they start to, where does healing actually begin? Is it an awareness? Is it the talking? Is it rewriting the narrative? Is it just takes time? How does healing actually occur?
Like, you begin in a moment's notice, right? Like, just the thought that, there's something new. There's like a new way to think about this, or a new data. And that's a lot of times what will happen is someone comes in to do therapy, right? And then I can look and say, if we work together for it, they're so much better over months or even over years, right? But oftentimes we can trace the improvement back to the very first session of saying, I hear what you're saying, and there's another way of seeing this that I think is not just a sleight of hand, but is a way that's actually consistent with truth, right? And I can say that to you because we're all unique, but we fit patterns, and I've seen this pattern over and over again, which gives me the hope that through the unique lens of you, there's a different way of thinking about this is real and true and can merge. And there's like sometimes you get in a maze look because we don't like damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? And we often have these conflicts in us, these central conflicts of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Right.
I gotta change this, and I can't change this, right? And you feel like, look, that's not the only two options, and it's not a sleight of hand. And that's very important because often people think, well, psychotherapy is about getting you to feel better. It's not about getting you to feel better if that's through a lens of falsehood.
Yeah.
Right? If a person's really doing things to feel ashamed about, let's talk about that and change it. Right? Like, the idea is to make you feel good about things that you should feel bad about. Right? The idea is to help you not feel bad about things that you shouldn't feel bad about. So that's what we're doing. And sometimes it involves medicines, and there are other things to do. And sometimes there are medical problems involved. There's a thyroid problem. Like there's so many other aspects of it that need to be taken stock of.
Yes.
But the healthcare system is in a shambles, and the mental health system is so surface focused that I don't mean to be critical. Like there's so many good individual practitioners within the systems, but the systems are broken. So you could very well go in and get treatment and not have anyone actually talk about trauma. And I've seen this over and over. People who've had, and I'm not making this up or exaggerating, 4, 5, 6 residential stays for addiction, right? And addiction where if you just sit and talk with that person, it's very obvious. Like the person's trying to kill themselves, right? It's not, they can't stay away from that substance. Sometimes you see that, but you see stories. It's about, hey, what is this person looking for, right? They're looking for escape from suffering, or they're trying to be not alive anymore because they want to end their own suffering, or because they think they deserve it. That's just punishment they feel, right? And the majority of times, no one has taken any trauma history from that person. So that is a failure of our systems. When very clearly, if you start talking about trauma, that's where the money's at, so to speak, the majority of times. And why is that person doing that? And you start learning what's their inner dialogue. What happened to them? Was it acute trauma, chronic trauma, vicarious trauma? But you come down to the trauma, and if you get under the hood and you address the problems, right, then the drive to the substance changes. I mean, that is, in my strong opinion, the way most people who are in remission from substance use, they're not using substance anymore. It's not in their life, right? That illness, that disease, that addiction is over, right? How did that happen?
What usually
addressing trauma?
By addressing trauma.
By addressing trauma. Really? Absolutely. The vast majority.
Almost all
trauma is the drive.
Almost all addiction is stemming from a trauma. Like a substance abuse addiction, let's say.
Yeah, the majority of it. Can I say it's 70% or 90%? But we're talking about very high numbers, which is why when you talk with people who have quote unquote failed addiction treatment, right, which I think is a very awful way to put it. Often why have they failed addiction treatment? Because the addiction treatment didn't address what's actually going on in them.
The trauma.
Right. It didn't address trauma. It says, look, you're gonna buckle down and you're gonna, I think AA does people a lot of good service, right? But there's a way in which this can get extrapolated. We'll give it up to your higher power and take an inventory, but you're not really looking at what's driving the dysfunction, right? And that appeals to the aspects of our society that want quick fixes, right? We want quick fixes, we want them to be inexpensive.
And not painful.
Right. And not painful. Right. And it's painful to talk about trauma, to go through. Now, people, when they see they're getting healthier, it's very interesting how people, in a sense, welcome the pain. Really, the pain of working out. This is difficult, but you get healthier, right? Right. So the same thing can happen when the trauma treatment is arduous, but I know I'm getting healthier. But our systems, really, I come back to this analogy that our systems are built to polish the hood. And trauma treatment it's more expensive, right? It takes place over time. It involves human beings who are well-trained interacting with other human beings. And it's a lot easier to just say, look, let's polish the surface of anything and spruce it up a little bit and then throw some medicines at people. And that's why we absolutely do not solve these problems. And they're not rocket science problems to solve. By a redirection of priority and resources and recognizing what problem this is, we can appropriately help the people who are suffering from it and often have no route to help, even if they're well insured.
Yeah. What will happen in the world over the next 20 years if we don't start addressing our traumas sooner?
I think we're in real trouble. And I don't want to be a doomsayer, things are just going to get worse. But our increased interconnectedness, so to say through social media, which can do a lot of good, but also is a route to instantaneously do a lot of bad, right? And the ability to instantaneously reach one another, often in aggressive ways. And I believe that it's trauma that unhinges us from facts, right? I mean, how many factual disputes has there been? I mean, classics, look at crowd signs. You could have a third grader in any country in the world that says, is this crowd bigger than this crowd? Okay, that's pretty obvious, right? Why would people insist that what's smaller is bigger, right? How do we get that way, right? Then we get that way through trauma, which says, what does that say? I mean, if you and I can both have 1 + 1, but I insist it's 3, right? When you're saying it's 2, and I'm going to stick to my guns, you might say, what's wrong with me, right? Well, what's wrong is I'm not actually prioritizing what's right. It's a way of saying, look, I don't actually care what's right now. Right. What I want to do is assert myself, right? I'm angry, right? I feel denigrated. I feel dismissed. I feel lousy about myself. I'm going to have my way. And if I say 1 + 1 is 3, I'll fight you. I'll fight you to death about it. Right? Why? Because it's not about what's true. It's about the fact that I feel hurt and angry. And like, how is that not running through our society in all sorts of ways? And the ability to reach one another so quickly, being detached from facts, right, which I think that comes from trauma, then escalates, and we're more and more aggressive with one another, right? We're more and more, I think there was some of the behavior and demeanor, like, you and I grew up in a similar era. Some of what people say and do on a public stage.
Social media, yeah.
Right. I mean, you think about the criticism.
I would never go up to someone's face and do that.
I would never do that. Even the criticism of, it's almost like hard to say, but the criticism of people who died or were captured in combat for our country, right? To have criticized someone, it was unimaginable, right? I mean, I was raised in a Christian church. I would just as soon gone into church and scream profanity, right? It is such shame to do that, but yet somehow the aggression in that appeals to people who have their own frustrated aggressions. Somehow that's okay, right? And I think this loss of demeanor and comportment, like, what does that actually mean to say that? Like, who are you hurting, right? How many people are you hurting with a dead loved one, right? Or a loved one captured in combat, is missing in action, and we're just going to denigrate that wholesale. Like, how do we get at a point in society where we trust, we accept that from people in positions of power, instead of saying, hey, I don't care what your agenda is. Like, your agenda could be make my life better. Right? That's your whole political agenda. Make this guy's life better. I will still vote against you because there's a higher set of ethics and morals in me that says, even if like what you're saying I think is good for me, I'm going to reject that anyway. Right? And we don't see that like we used to see it. Right? And we need to reground to, what are our values, right? What are the things that are more important than like me being right or me getting my way or having some political say? And it's just right. It's a long answer to your question, but it speaks to why I think like, how's that going to be better unless we look at what's undergirding us that would lead us in the most basic of ways to argue that 1 + 1 is 3 when like clearly it's not. Like, we have to go and look at that, and that is driven by trauma.
So trauma, what I'm hearing you say is people who are hurt and angry, there's a trauma underneath that. Otherwise you wouldn't be angry if you didn't have a trauma that you haven't dealt with.
Right. And if we don't see that, we continue to like not understand. Like, how is it that we can't understand one another, right? Because I'm trying to convince you and you're trying to convince me. But if we're both coming from that hurt, angry place, then what I often will witness is like, these two people are arguing, right? I'll see this in some political debate, and not one of them is what the facts are, right? They both just want to be right. And how does that not come from a place of hurt? Like, if you feel reasonably good about yourself and you feel like, I've been able to make my way in life, right? And if I put in 5 cents of effort, I can get 5 cents back for it, right? If you really feel that you have opportunity, right? Then how are you hurt and angry enough to argue over what's true and what's not true, right? I just want to be right. I don't care. It doesn't happen except through that lens of trauma.
Yeah. What would you say the main symptoms that you see then from people a majority of the time? Is it more based on a depression or an angst, or is it? And where's that? What's the trauma underneath that? If you see depression, angst, frustration when they come in, is it sexual trauma? Is it, parents got divorced early? Is it they were bullied? Is it they just didn't feel loved, or they got something happened? Kind of what's the main traumas that you're seeing underneath the depression and angst?
Well, so it's a complicated answer, but to try and simplify, like, the most common traumas I see are the most common traumas, right? Like, so sexual abuse is so prevalent, neglect is so prevalent. So that's what I see the most of, but simply because it's the most prevalent, right? How traumas impact us is so unique, right, to each individual person. And some of that involves, when did the trauma occur, right? So the more formative the years, right, the more difficult it is, or the deeper the impact can be. So part of it is like, what was the timing of the trauma, right? Part of it is also like, what is the person internalizing or externalizing, right? So people who are externalizing can become very sort of outspoken and impactful on the world in negative ways, right? Whether that's through a political lens or through a lens of being violent, right? Of abusing and hurting others. Like there are people who are traumatized and they repeat that trauma on others. That's certainly not everyone, but like that's a known phenomenon, right? And that's the externalizing of feeling such fury and such vulnerability inside that the way to try and gain mastery is to then be abusive to others, right? Which can start with like kids bullying other kids, right? To kids repeating the same sexual or relationship trauma as adults as was perpetrated on them, right? So we see, so is someone more likely to be externalizing? More often than not, people are internalizing, and that's when we see depression, anxiety, isolation, right? Sleep disturbance because they can't get it to stop in their brains. And then the last factor is like what kind of sort of emotional compass we have. I mean, there are people who can be very resilient and have a lot of trauma, right? And then there are people for whom things that we might, on a grand scale of things, consider relatively mild impact them very significantly because there's such a finely tuned then emotional trauma. So we have to say, okay, what is the trauma? What is the trauma doing in this person? Then we have to look to what kind of support mechanisms do they have? Like, there's so much to it.
Right.
So it's maybe a non-answer to the question, but it brings out like the factors involved.
Yes. What happens to our brain when we experience a big trauma, especially in the formal years?
Yeah. The brain, we have the ability now to look at like what's going on in the brain. Like, not in the way hopefully we will someday, but to say, look, how's your brain functioning? What parts of it are more active, right? What parts of it are communicating with other parts, right? And so trauma, for example, it makes the vigilance systems in us much more active, right? So you will see if you take people who, they're similar in many ways as most we can get them, but one group has really significant trauma, the other doesn't, right? Now again, it's an inexact science, right? But you can divide into two groups, and then you see if someone without trauma, like sees a person coming towards them, right? The parts of the brain that are interested in, like, well, who are you? How are you approaching me? What's the context, right? Is there something like collaborative or interesting? I want to shake your hand. Like, I'm interested, right? But if you see through the lens of trauma, it's all coming through vigilance, which is all like, I'm just looking at you for, are you going to hurt me?
Wow.
Right? And like the changes in the brain are so profound. So if you think about how do you navigate life in an optimal way, if like, instead of like seeing your boss come towards you and thinking like, oh, I'm doing a good job, like, this person's coming towards me, and we can have a conversation like, I get a promotion out of this. I can make a good point for myself. If you just think like, how's that person going to harm me? You act entirely different, right? Or people seeking relationships. If everything is scanning for who's going to be hurtful, right? How do you find the person, right? Who could be a good relationship partner? And by the way, people who are predatory can absolutely tell that, right? Because you see people who are predatory and say, how do they decide who to date, who to work with? They're scanning the room for the person who is. Oh, absolutely. And the predatory people who then are sociopathic, and predatory is a form of sociopathy, right? Often have gone through their own trauma, but they're externalizing. And then they're so good, because I'll see this sometimes when I'm in a room full of people, and I know, say most of the people, I know people in the room, and I know who's vulnerable, right? Now there's someone else in the room I also know is predatory, and that person's sort of sharing with me who they're interested in. And I'm like, wow.
They're probably not even thinking about it though.
No, they're not.
Just like unconsciously happening.
Right, because they can see things like body language, how the micro affective changes, how you keep someone else's gaze, whether you look away. It's having some sort of training in it. I can see some aspects of that myself, but not nearly. I was a psychiatrist for 20 years. I'm not nearly as good at that as someone who's predatory, because that's in them naturally.
That's just in them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about narcissists in the world today. Is a narcissist someone who's just been heavily traumatized and is externally communicating that as opposed to internally doing it?
Really? Yes. I think narcissists, it's a relatively small portion of the population that does the majority of the damage. And I would say it that strong, because people who are narcissistic, so there's that externalizing element, right? And that has nothing there's no interrelation there of like intelligence, capability, right? So people who are narcissistic can be very capable people in the world, and often those resources inside of them, the way they're imposing themselves in the world is in a way that's about destruction, right? Because narcissism comes through the lens of envy, right? And envy is different. Like there's different lexicons, right? But the way that I sort of learned this in the lexicon I use, jealousy is sort of annoying, right? Like if you have something I want, I'd like to have it too. Maybe I'll work hard for it, right? Or maybe I can't get it, right? Like someone's younger than I can't make myself younger. Okay, there are other things I can hang my hat on of how I feel about myself. Envy is very different. Envy is destructive, and it wants to bring others down. It's to say, if I'm here and I think you're here, I don't need to come here, right? I can bring you down here, right? And people do that. Like a classic example is like the old example of like men whistling at women, right? I mean, how many times has a woman turned around and said, "Oh, you whistled at me, like, let's go out on a date," right? Like, so it's not designed to be effective, right? In what one might think, like, oh, it's a way of opening up some, some possibility, right? It's not that. It's a sense of desire and a sense of anger and frustration that then says, hey, I can't take away that person's, whatever it is, their beauty or their youth. I can't take that away, but I can make that person feel awful, right? So you whistle at them, and now this feels predatory and be set upon it. And people, describe what that feels. It doesn't feel good, right? That's envy. It's saying, I can't have what you have, right? And I can't actually take it away from you, but I can do just as good, right? I can make you feel awful about yourself. It doesn't matter you have those things I want. I took them away from you. And that's where narcissism, coming through that lens of envy and capability, when I see mass destruction, whether it's in a family or perhaps on our political landscape, and you look, what's the roots of that? More often than not, you come to narcissism. We don't realize the immense dangers that not recognizing what is that about, right? And that's about the self, and that person is trying to fill a bottomless pit. You don't ever feel the bottom. You can take everything away from everybody.
You're not full.
And you're not full because you just threw it all into a bottomless pit.
How does a narcissist learn how to heal their own trauma when they typically would never want to say that something's wrong with them?
It's very hard. People who are suffering from narcissism, whether it's internalized, it's more like if it's internalizing, but even then, it's hard because there's so much shame associated with that and with admitting or acknowledging anything, right? It takes what's called ego strength, right? In the old sense of ego as like what's good about us at our best, our most knowledgeable, right? It takes ego strength to say difficult things about the self, right? So people who suffer from narcissism very, very rarely will bring themselves to treatment.
Really?
Right?
Yeah. They'll resist therapy for years, right?
Very, very rarely. When they come to treatment, it's often because there's some external impetus.
Like they're obligated to, or they feel like
that person's family says, like, look, you really just can't come back unless you're behaving differently, right? Or they've gotten in some legal trouble somewhere, like, you have to go do some therapy work. Or, there often is some element of compulsion. Like, there are things that we are more likely to seek help for as humans, and things we are less likely, because narcissism is such a strong defense against shame and inadequacy. Then you can see how that kind of falls into the category of people much less likely. So we go get help for that, and it's a whole defensive structure, right? It's not about like people can often separate. Like I kind of know who I am, and I know how I am when I get depressed, and I don't like that because like that's not me to be like lethargic, and I'm not getting out of bed, and I'm not there for people I love, and I don't like that, and I want to be back to me. It's different when what's going on is like that is part of the character structure. That is the person, and it takes a lot of courage to recognize something like that. So look, I want to make that better in myself, and I know I've got to look at really difficult things. I've worked with people who do that.
Really,
you just don't see it.
It's rare. Yeah. When does that usually happen? Where they come to you? Is it like their world is falling apart, or they're just have a massive breakdown? Or
yes.
That's when they're finally like, okay, I surrender.
And that's what kind of makes the compulsion, right? Because like something in the world falling apart is like, hey, you have to go, or your family wants to see you, something like that, right? But even then, there's often a push and pull. Like, we could all do this in therapy. Sometimes we try and keep things on the surface because we go a little deeper and it's going to be painful. But there can be a lot of that because ideas have to come to therapy because I think I should, or something tells me I should, but I don't want the vulnerability. which is why you need to build a relationship and trust before you can start talking about difficult things.
Is there any way to heal trauma without re-experiencing the pain of the trauma? Or do you gotta go through the pain in order to get to the other side?
I mean, to some degree, I think you have to go through the pain. And there are exceptions where someone, is sort of blessed with a lot of ego strength and a lot of resilience, and can look and say, look, I know this is true about me, and this is like something I don't want it to be here for me, and they can sort of compartmentalize and partition it. But that's usually not how that goes, right? Usually we have to look at the pain of it, but that doesn't mean like reliving every detail, and a lot of times people sort of think if I'm going to go get, even in my own mind, right, do trauma work, let alone with another person, I'm going to have to say every detail about something.
You won't say every detail. So you're saying, or you will? Most
often, a person doesn't have to, right? Sometimes it's necessary when the sense of shame is so lodged in the details. Sometimes you do have to go through all of it. But more often than not, we're talking about the idea of not having to go through every detail also emphasizes the shared humanity of it, right? That, how many of us are traumatized? There's a commonality to that by someone telling me about what their trauma is and how that makes them feel, there's still vulnerability and exposure to that, then we can have a shared understanding of it. Like, I can put words and they can put words so where, they can feel that I get what's going on inside of them without them having to the person having to go through and say, every last aspect of it.
What's your definition of shame?
So shame, there's this idea of like core affects in us. And it's kind of a technicality, but affects are sort of arousements, right? And like we think often of arouse as a sexual word. You can see how it's that way, like something turns a person on without choice, right? Yes. But lots of things are arousements, right? Somebody comes in front of you and pushes you, like fear or anger are aroused, right? And we know that because that courses through the person's body. Right, and you see like changes in skin conducts. The person's getting ready for fight or flight, right? And the brain patterns change, and then they know it. Right. So that's interesting, right? The knowledge of it comes after because that's actually less important, right? For say staying alive, right? And the same is true with shame. Like shame is arousing us, and it's just this awful feeling, right, of like terribleness of the self, right? And you think, why are these core affects in us, right? It's very clearly about survival, right? I mean, that example of someone appears in front of you and pushes you, and your whole body gets ready to fight or flight, and then you know it. It says, right, that's about survival.
Right.
And shame has a function in us too, right? Imagine like doing something shameful when humans, we still do in some cases, live in small groups, right? But if you got up in the middle of the night and ate all the food, it's okay if you feel shame, like you have shame imposed on you the next day. You just like don't do that again, because that could take everybody's life, right? So there's a function to it, right? But when it's aroused in us, and it's not aroused in a sense for good reason, like one hasn't done something shameful, right? But it's aroused because of that feeling of vulnerability, right? And trauma can be chronic, like the chronic trauma of systemic racism that tells somebody like, oh, you are less than. They get that message over and over and over again, right? Like it's a different kind of trauma. It's no less valid, right? Where we see it, of course, most dramatically is in acute trauma, right? The person I would see in an emergency room after a rape who's talking about how ashamed they feel, right? And it's like, why? Okay, because the shame is aroused in the person, it's created, right? From the sense of vulnerability, a sense of terror, right? And then if that person doesn't have a route like that says, of course that was created in you, right? And now we need to talk about what to do with it. Because if we don't, we know what it will do. It will go inside of you, right? There starts the changes to the immune system, and that person is more likely to then have an autoimmune problem later on in life, more likely to get cardiovascular disease, more likely to become depressed, more likely to abuse substances. It's like, that's what happens because that shame becomes the persecutor inside of you.
Wow.
So let's look at that. And if we can look at that in an emergency room right after something has happened, like that's a great time to do that, and to because you get most help to that person acutely. But what's amazing is we can do that 40 years later too, and still get an impact, because a parallel to physical health is like an abscess, right? It's like an infection inside of us that's walled off, right? And sometimes there can be an abscess that doesn't do anything to us, right? But more often than not, it spins off symptoms. low-grade fever, feeling of fatigue, jittery, like this, it's not good to have inside of us, and we'll see it track forward like an abscess would over years and years and years, where that thing inside is spinning off all these negative thoughts and feelings and choices, right? And we can go get at that, unlock it, expose it to the light of day, and then it doesn't have to be doing that anymore. There's actually kind of a simplicity. How trauma makes shame that's aroused in us comes back into it, just gets walled off, and then changes our feelings about ourselves, which then changes our memories, and then changes our mood, anxiety, behavior, and everything else. Like, there's a simplicity to that story, right? And truth in mental health is grounded in simplicity. Range are lots of things are complicated, but like things that are truths make mean they're easy. But there's a simplicity to understanding them. And so it's a long answer to the question. That's how we get at what happens from trauma and aroused shame, and how we get to like 40 years later and something's rolled off inside the person and has harmed them now for all those years.
The sooner you can address it, the better.
Yeah, absolutely.
The sooner the better. For 25 years, I wasn't able to sleep at night. It'd take me an hour, 2 hours every night to fall asleep. And I didn't know why. I was just like, my mind was racing, but I didn't understand why it happened for so long. Literally, within a few days after I opened up about sexual abuse for the first time, and I'm 30 years old, it's like I can fall asleep within like 5 to 10 minutes. And I go, my whole life I haven't been able to sleep. Or just I'd lay there in bed for hours, finally asleep, then have to, wake up late. I never felt like I could really get a rhythm going. And now
it's amazing. It's so amazing what you said, like just by talking about it, opening up about it, and then something that deeply impactful for years. Like you probably had a conception of like, that's me.
That's me.
Right?
My identity.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
That's not going to change. So I'm up against that all the time. And then, lo and behold, it changes.
Yeah.
Right? And I think there's brain biology behind that. And I would even locate that. I think areas like the ventral tegmentum, the amygdala, like I can think of like the parts of your brain that I think were so spun up, because when you internalize that feeling of responsibility or shame or whatever was inside of you, that it comes with vulnerability and it makes hypervigilance.
Yes.
And then those parts of the brain don't want to sleep. Right? It's not like you weren't sleeping.
But like protect yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It says your part of your brain is saying this is good for you, because this inability to sleep may keep you alive. Right? So if that part of the brain has its say, that's why that gets perpetuated, because the brain decides, right, this isn't great, but it's the best it gets. Right? But then when you, even opening up about it, which must have relieved, like glancing an abscess, right?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, then those parts of the brain quiet down, and your whole brain decides, you know what's good at night? Restful sleep. Right? Why don't we get some of that? Because I am actually safe, right? You always have that feeling like I'm safe with the cameras. I can go to sleep, but like I don't think anything bad's gonna happen to me when I'm sleeping. And like, look at the immensity of that change, just by talking about it. Like, it's so powerful because it's so deeply impactful, and it can happen with such a rapid shift of just letting it out. And I think why? Because it's a shift. What must have happened in you is a shift towards truth.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Talking about it and then rewriting the story, like you said,
right?
Which is huge.
Right.
And the story for me was, I'm not enough, I'm not lovable, I'm abused, I get taken advantage of. There was like a constant, so I was always on guard, looking out for that.
Right.
As opposed to rewriting the story. And I think that's...
Isn't it fascinating that that's the same words I hear put to it from people across the spectrum? Right, no matter what, demographics of age, gender, type of trauma, in myself, like that's my dialogue too, right? Because that's what shame makes it, right? That you're not good enough, no one will love you, you can never be safe. That's the messaging, and that's the reason that I wrote that book, was the realization over years of doing this that like I hear that all the time. No matter what type of trauma or what type of person is in front of me, I think, well, there's something going on here at a sort of foundational level of our brains, right? And then if you think about the psychology and the neuroscience of it, it tells us the answer to it.
This is powerful stuff. What else do we need to know about trauma? Or for anyone listening or watching, if they haven't started to process certain things, or maybe they feel this angst or frustration or depression feeling, what else would you say to them listening about what they can do next?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I would say is to emphasize what's going on inside of you is not too complicated to be solved, right? Because that's the thought. Like we get thoughts on top of thoughts on top of thoughts, and it seems so impossible. Like I'm trying to untie a Gordian knot, right? Like how am I going to figure my way out of this, right? And to know that like it's not actually true, right? It's not too complicated to be solved, right? But we come at it in different ways. Probably like the story of the Gordian knot is thousands of years old, right? I think, right? It's mythology, right? That like that's not what we do. There are things that we can't unravel, but that we don't have to, right? And the idea of make a new narrative, look at what's inside of you, because you don't have to untie that anymore, right? So know that a sense of simplicity is your friend, right? And that gives us a great deal of hope, and that we can start to feel better very soon. And I think it's wonderful how you describe how your life changed in just a few days, right? And like that's really the truth. I remember when I first went in and saw a therapist, I didn't know what to do with the person. Like, how am I supposed to perform? All these thoughts in my head. I remember saying, like, my brother killed himself, and it's like feeling so much, just even putting it to words, because like there's an immensity to it that was beyond me. Right? So instead of like, that's my fault, I should have seen, I should have known, I should have done, right? I'm bad because I went off to college and I got this job, so I wasn't around home, I wasn't close to him. Like all these things, just saying that was like, well, this is bigger than you, right? And things that are bigger than us give us some freedom from them. And even the idea that like people do terrible things to other people, right? So because we get so lost in like maybe that our traumas are unique, but the idea that like this never happens to anyone else, right? And the idea that no, like, people abuse other people, and people die in accidents, and people commit suicide, and like there's a shared humanness to this, and I think that's so important in doing the work. That like I don't understand like hiding who we are in our work, right? We're all traumatized, right? In my view of things, because that's what I see in the world around me, and sharing that. Have an idea of what you feel, because my trauma is not yours, and I'm not being presumptuous in the way of saying I understand that, but the underlying feelings of shame and frustration, like I understand that, and that's mostly what people want is a sense of, because if I feel so isolated and then I talk to you and I'm going to feel like you're looking back at me like you can understand me and you're not recoiling from me, right? In fact, you may be coming closer metaphorically, right? Because you can relate to what's going on in me. It takes away the idea that, if I share any of this, I expose to the world what an awful, unlovable, undesirable person. Yeah. So, like the old adage of like turn on the lights and show the child the clothes tree, right? That looks like a monster, right? And that's how we get inside of us. I can't look at this; it's incredibly complicated. And what shame will it make in me to talk about it? It's like, no, it's the exact opposite of turn the lights on, look at it, and we can look everywhere around. And what does that make? Makes things better.
By talking about your shame.
Yeah, by shining the light everywhere. Like, how do you? I've talked to people about their feeling of shame and responsibility. Let's talk about all of it. Again, it's got to be done over time in a careful way. And then, again, talk about the nuances of what they feel inside of it. They hold on to responsibility and can get to a point of saying, look, my responsibility is to take care of myself and be a good person in the world. I'm not responsible for things that I had no control over. And like that's very, very liberating, where you're not, on the one hand, you're acknowledging the uniqueness of that experience in that person. And on the other hand, you're mapping that to the shared humanity that says you are not singled out by humanity for awful things to happen to you. And like that's, wow, that can be tremendous.
Yeah, when I started opening up about it, I remember quickly being able to fall asleep at night, when it probably took me 8 or 9 months to be able to fully talk about it openly with friends, family, and not feel like stressed.
Right.
Every time I talked about it, first to family, I was a little worried what they're going to think. Then to kind of close friends. Then I started, through my podcast and my work, I felt more of an opportunity to really serve people. And I felt like this kind of nagging thing, like I should probably be vulnerable on my show.
Right.
So, but I was afraid to talk about it for many months. Because I was like, what if it ruins my business and my life? And people look at me differently in the public. My friends and family have to love me. But, publicly it might be different. I felt more of a duty because as a young kid, I didn't see older men talking about it. You know, in the 80s and 90s, I didn't see men saying I was sexually abused on TV, or at least I wasn't exposed to it.
Right.
Maybe they were, but I wasn't seeing it.
Well, I didn't see it either. If they were, we both missed it.
Exactly.
Right?
And so I felt more like, the more I realized, like 1 in 6 boys, I was like, man, someone's got to speak up about it. I might as well do it, you know, if I have this opportunity. So, but it was a process. It was a journey. It took, 8-9 months till I felt more and more comfortable talking about things. But at least I was feeling more peaceful inside within days of exposing the light to issue.
Yes. And 2 really important points that rose to the surface. One is you said, what can people do today? Right? And it's remarkable. It's not just some shallow thing to say. Like, when you do good for other people, you know that there's good in you to do. You see your worth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think from understanding, you're describing part of your healing was, I can talk about this in a way that has to help other people, right?
Yes.
And then what's that? That puts the lie to those thoughts inside. Like, how can you not be good enough? How can you not make any positive impact if you can do this and make life better for people? Yeah. And that's often what people start doing is they take a meal to the person down the road who lost someone in their life, or they smile at someone when they might have been annoyed because they held them up in lines, right? These things are really, really important. They're important because they are good for other people, but they reinforce, hey, there's good in the self, right? So that part is very important. And then another aspect of this that I think is a huge deterrent in our society that wants immediate results, right? It's why we use 5 times as much medicines as, say, the Dutch, right? Because they don't want immediate results. Right? If you're overweight, exercise more, like that, right? Let me just give you a medicine, right? But we want immediate results, and then we get frustrated that things don't change in our brain immediately, right? There's an adage in neuroscience that the neurons that fire together wire together, right? So if you and I just picked a word right now and we said it over and over again 500 times, I guarantee we'll be saying it tonight, right? I'll be saying it over my brain tomorrow morning, right? Why? Right? Because just the fact that we said it 500 times, our brain's going to hold on to it. It essentially doesn't believe us. Because it was a silly experiment, like eject it from the brain, please. It doesn't do that, right? And these patterns inside of us only atrophy, right? So people, I talk to people a lot about this, right? Because otherwise people start feeling better and doing better, but they still have that same thought in their head. It may be there less frequently. Right? And someone needs to say to them, hey, here's how this goes away. It atrophies, right? Over time. Yeah. It's less and less. And I've worked with people who maybe had 10, 20 years of nonstop negativity. Then they change their lives. And they'll say, wow, it's 10 years later. That will still come into my head, right? I do something, I drop a big thing of milk in a store and it shatters and everyone's looking at that and they're like, you should kill yourself, right? Because that was in their head before, but they've gotten to the point where they're like, hey, I don't actually believe that, right? That there's the proof that those neuronal connections die hard if you reinforce them over time. So that's why we need to do longitudinal work, whether it's on ourselves or in therapy, and to realize it's okay that it doesn't go away all at once, right? That's actually the best that happened. And what you described, in a sense, is very classic. You felt better in really strong, identifiable ways very quickly, but then the cognitive patterns in you took much longer to change. Right, because that's the way it works in us, right? But we don't learn that. I joke, half joke, right? I'm going to write a book on everything I need to learn about life, I need to know about life. I learned as a post-medical school psychiatry, right? Because I really believe we should be learning these things in elementary school. I'm not the only one to think that. Why are we not teaching about, why is that bully behaving that way, right? Why don't we look at how that person can feel better about themselves in a different way? Look at what's going on at home, right? Help the people understand who are being bullied, right? That person something is hurting that person, right? So they're coming after you and they're making fun of your clothes or your looks or whatever it is, right? But that's, what that's about? It's about them, right? So you then externalize them, but we don't do that. And then we grow up without all this really basic knowledge. And I remember being a second-year psychiatry resident. So I had another career before this. So by then I'm in my early 30s, right? I was around 30 years old, and I'm a second-year postgraduate resident. I was like, oh my God, why didn't I learn this in second grade? And I think we need to start teaching ourselves these things as adults and then also to kids, because that's how we protect the children. There's a chapter in there where I talk with Stephanie Untitled, who's a child advocate, right? A child abuse advocate. I think that chapter, brings out like how we can educate and empower children in ways that we just don't now. And sometimes there are dramatic things that happen then, but sometimes there are things that are, in a sense, more insidious if they're less dramatic. Like somebody who's just bullied, right, for whatever reason, or they look different than everybody else, or they have less resources than everyone else, and there's nothing dramatic happening, right? No one identified that as problematic, but that person is every bit as traumatized, and their sense of self is changing. We just have to change this. It's so clear and obvious that we have to change it.
If you could teach 3 things to second graders, what would you teach them?
Well, pay attention to what's going on inside of you, right? The idea that we think, I have a daughter who's 7, and she wants to count together, but in our heads, right? Because it's interesting to her now that she can say things and she can think them in her heads, right? And engendering that kind of reflective, what's going on inside of you, we can do with children, right? And we can help them put words to whatever that is, right? That and what we wouldn't use these words, but attribution, right? Whose fault is something, right? And again, the classic element of bullying. I mean, if you ask kids, what's going on? The kids who are being bullied. I mean, they always they blame it on themselves, right? There's not the cognitive mechanism. Look, I've sat with kids who said horrible things. They've been burned with cigarettes and locked in closets, right? And they have a story of how that's their fault, because the brain doesn't know enough to think differently. If you're that age, you can't make it a more esoteric attribution. You don't know enough, right? But if someone helps you to look and say, oh, you feel ashamed of yourself because that person tells you to, right? But what's actually going on? It's not that hard to communicate in age appropriate language. So don't just blame everything on you, right? And you can also go, are you doing things that you should feel bad? If you're talking to the bully, right? Do you want that person to understand you're hurting these other kids, right? And does that feel good? If so, why? Right? Same when you're with adults. Why does it? If it feels good that you're hurting people, let's talk about why is that, right? Because where do we get to that? 100% of the time, we get to trauma. We get to something that's some version of, I don't feel good about myself, and it feels powerful to hurt other people. But boy, you get at that in 2nd grade instead of 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, then you can really change that. There's an aspect of this that I do feel kind of regresses back to the mean of just common sense, and I think that is in the book. If it were an academic book, I wouldn't have had it in me to put the time and effort into writing, right? But the idea that there's a simplicity and a common sense here that can really the light bulb can go off. I know how I can make this better, right? I can look at what's going on in my head. I can rethink the narrative. I can do something good for someone else. That can all start happening today.
This is powerful stuff, Paul. I want people to get the book. It's called Trauma, the Invisible Epidemic, How Trauma Works and How We Can Heal from It. I want to have you come back on and do a couple more hours on this stuff, because I feel like it's fascinating work that you're doing. You work with a lot of big, entrepreneurs, CEOs, celebrities, world-class athletes and individuals, and also people in day-to-day life, living their lives, working their careers in relationships, and dealing with their own challenges.
You see the world, right? And you work across the socioeconomic spectrum, man. You just see that we are so all the same, and we're kidding ourselves if we think that whatever we've gotten for ourselves, some status, something that is good to celebrate good things we make in our lives. But let's not mistake that for the shared humanity in all of us, which I think is very, very hopeful. The shared humanity of trauma is absolutely true. And if we think of it that way, well, that's how we heal from it as a society.
Is it harder to heal trauma if you have a bigger platform, or if you're a celebrity, would you say? As opposed to, maybe not that many people know about you?
Yes.
It's harder.
Yeah, because fame brings to other people the feeling of they have a right to make some sort of pronouncement about a person, right? And sometimes that comes through the lens of someone who really legitimately admires them, right? But there are, a significant subset of people who are externalizing their trauma, right? Who are attractive to people who are famous in order to tear them down, right? And we see that in the media, right? Fame can bring good things, but it also brings danger.
Yeah. I have 2 final questions for you. But again, I want people to get the book, Trauma, the Invisible Epidemic, How Trauma Works and How We Can Heal from It. Lots of practical stuff in here. I see Peter Attia, who we've had on the show, who's left a quote for you as well. A lot of other great people. So make sure you guys get the book. You're not on social media, but they can, or are you? I didn't see you.
LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, okay.
So one social media platform.
But drpaulconti.com is where they can learn more about you and the book, and they can go get it on Amazon, obviously, and Barnes & Noble, and things like that. So check out the book. This question is called The 3 Truths. Maybe you've already kind of answered it a little bit, but I ask everyone this at the end of our interviews. I'd like you to imagine that it's your last day on Earth many years away. Okay, to live as long as you want to live, but then eventually it's the last day for you. And you get to accomplish all your dreams. All the things you want to create, they come true. But for whatever reason, all of your written work and content, videos and audios, for whatever reason, they go somewhere else. So we don't have access to this content anymore, okay, or the book. Okay. But you could leave behind 3 things you know to be true, 3 lessons you would share with the world. And this is all we would have from you. What would you say would be those 3 truths for you?
Look at what's going on inside of you. How are you treating other people? How are you treating yourself?
Before I ask the final question, Paul, I want to acknowledge you for the incredible work you're doing. You know, to be doing this for 2 decades, to be helping so many people in your practice consistently, to be creating this book so that we can have tools and information to help heal ourselves and get to the root of why we're frustrated or angry or depressed or something's off. It's all based on the traumas that we've dealt with and we've experienced and haven't dealt with yet and integrated through healing. So I really acknowledge you for putting your work out there in a way that we can consume it and understand something that is so scary to look at for so many of us. It's terrifying for a lot of people to face their shame. And so I acknowledge you for doing this work. And I hope that, of course, and I hope people get the book. It's forwarded by Lady Gaga, so
Mm. 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 Hmm. 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 Hmm.
Compromise.
Yeah, well, no, it's not your SIN number that's compromised.
Yeah, because you need that also.
It's your banking information that's compromised. Your SIN number is irrelevant.
No, they have to change my direct deposit on the Service Canada site. You actually need.
Okay, I need to focus, Cam. Cause like I'm already fucking. I was supposed to be gone 40 minutes ago.
Okay.
And I can't use my fucking hand. Like I'm just fucking pissed off right now.
You have your brakes.
Cam, it's not. I can't. I can't. You're asking questions that I can't answer. Where the fuck is it? For fuck's sake. Where the fuck did it go? I just need the fucking number. Oh, you guys suck. Ah. Yeah. Okay. Look. This is a perfect example of that. See the icons? This is a good indication as to something not right in your account.
Yeah.
That means that it's a different fucking logo. That means at some point in the redirect of me logging out, just logging out, you're pushing a button that is giving data out. And that is enough for someone to fuck with my shit. Wait, what? Why wasn't this number here yesterday? Yeah, that's the one. Your connection to Verdun, blah, blah, blah. Just give me the fucking number, man. 7. And I can't wait to get looped through another fucking automated messaging service, really. Because this has been happening since fucking my parents' fucking generation. Like, after the Great Depression, apparently. We've done this so many times.
Please note that no calls are taken between 12 and 1 o'clock. For information concerning the
Cameron, I've been waiting days for. I've been calling.
Stop fucking calling then at 12.
I did not just decide. This is the first time to call, and I'm like, oh, this is the first time I call, and now it's just actually so long. Whoopsie. It's been days I've been fucking calling.
At 12.
I fucking was supposed to have healthcare.
At 12.
Please don't start fucking with me, Cam. Please. I've been nice to you fucking all morning. Please don't fuck with me.
Fucking with you. It's just like.
Cause like I just can't do this right now. I need a fucking brace on my fucking hand, like fucking now.
It's almost there. It's like.
That's just one of the fucking stupid bullshit things that I have to do these days. Like one of the many bullshit things that I'm now having to do today. I'm super late for.